I first got started on gender ideology, an interest in gender ideology, when my middle schooler started our local public school. And the school board, I heard from a friend, the school board was planning on adding a policy to our non-discrimination policy that would add gender identity. And that was an open question as to what that meant for the whole school. And of course, the immediate concern was, how are we defining that? What does that mean? What does that mean for girls? You know, my girl, are there going to be boys in the girls' bathroom? All of that. And so I went to the school board meeting and was somewhat horrified to find that they were doing this just completely out of the blue. They'd blindsided our whole community with this policy kind of out of nowhere. Here, 30 days, we're going to pass this. Nobody given any thought to, well, they hadn't talked about anyone giving any thought to how this was going to impact anything at the schools. So there was a really big community uproar. And there were probably about 1,000 parents there. This is back in 2015. So Fairfax was one of the early, they pride themselves on being kind of a wedge, sort of the progressive wedge of school boards. I mean, you've got California, you've got, Maine, sometimes places like that, California, Oregon, Washington. Those are sort of like the crazy uncles at the school board table of the National School Board Association. But Fairfax is, because of the proximity to the capital and because it's one of the 10th largest school boards in the country, it's got disproportionate influence over other school boards. So they sort of, at these national meetings, they sort of, they can sort of lead the way a little bit. And so this was part, I think, of what they wanted to do. For the first time, they had a Democratic attorney general who was saying, yes, you can move ahead with this in the state of Virginia. So that was kind of my first introduction. I started, I did a little bit of research into what that would mean. And I mean, parents were really, really opposed to this. It passed. They said, oh, nothing's going to change. And then a few days later, they passed this curriculum that they had been quietly planning for 2 years. They give us 30 days notice, and it starts teaching all kinds of things in our family life education curriculum, like sex is on a spectrum, and its gender is fluid. This begins at, early on at birth. All kinds of things. This kind of subdivision of the psyche into these 4 areas of, all the things that you see in gender spectrum, schools in transition, some of these really progressive curricula. Or I'm not going to say progressive because not every progressive is there, but these very ideological curricula that you see in the platforms you see in gender spectrum and some of these other programs. So they wanted to, so that there's a whole process in Fairfax County that it goes through this curriculum. So parents were really incensed. The other thing that they did was they said, well, we have to pass these new standards of these new lessons in our family life education, our sex ed. It's a bit of a misnomer, but that's what they call our sex ed curriculum, is family life education. And they said that this curriculum, we have to pass it because it aligns with our new Virginia state standards of learning. So a couple of moms, I'm a real sort of dig in and research this stuff. And so a couple of moms and I looked at, okay, well, let's see what the new Virginia standards of learning say. And there was not a word in those standards of learning about this stuff. It was just, there was new stuff about diet, about, being nice to other kids, about things like that. There was nothing about this new controversial concept that, we're going to move teaching on transgender issues, transgender identity down to middle school, this sort of thing. So we had some pretty strong words for the school board when that meeting passed. I think mine got played on. You can't deceive an entire community, lie to a whole community like that and not get called out on it. It was just appalling. So, but that was the first of many. So that was how I first got interested. And then I've just kind of tracked it. Go ahead. I was on that. Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, I was appointed at the time. There were just 2, it shouldn't be ideological, but it is. There were 2 Republicans on that committee and 10 Democrats. now there are no Republicans at all. But I was appointed to serve on that sex ed committee by one of those two Republicans after all of that happened. And I thought, well, I'd rather light a candle than curse the darkness. So I'll get on this committee and I'll see if I can at least, if we're going to teach this stuff, at least add some balance and some medical evidence or something to it. And so for 3.5 years, I was a thorn in the flesh of the sex ed committee. And it's basically a rubber stamping coffee clutch every month or so. But I would come in with my binders of information and sort of studies that I'd read and stuff, and try sometimes to have an impact to try to persuade. We need to not do this or do that. They just have sort of an astounding lack of, I would say, lack of balance for one in what they teach, but also some of it's good, but there's just this underlying thread of we are the experts, and more information about sex and earlier and more controversial is always better. So we're always going to be pushing that envelope further and further down, and that's always better. And if you think that's a bad idea, then you are, at best a little confused about what's good for your child, and, probably actually really a bit of a bigot, but we're going to do our best to get past that and get to your kid anyways. I mean, that's an overstatement, but that's kind of a bit of a thread, certainly for some of them. There's well-intentioned people on there, but so. Is
there somebody behind this, or is it just kind of the zeitgeist leading everybody in the same direction? Like, have you located a push from a certain quarter, or is it just, right, this is the progressive?
So it's a mix. I would say that generally, and I've had conversations with teachers or people that are on that committee. I'm speaking in a bit of a just zeitgeist hyperbole fashion. It's kind of the underlying, the way people phrase things, the way teachers will say, we were able to save this kid, or there's representation from different groups. I think people that end up on the sex ed committee tend to be the ones that are most interested in pushing things that are a little bit more, more on the edge. Some of those people, people that thought let's see, one of them thought we really needed to teach about incest in first grade. There are things like that. One was upset we weren't teaching more explicitly about, other types of gay sex in, 7th grade or different ones. And this push now, they're trying to get everything on gender identity taught in elementary school. That's the current push before our school board right now. But that's kind of the general, I would say, there are certain members on the community and on the committee. Everybody gets appointed by a school board member, and then it's rounded out by school officials. But that's more background. And I got thrown off the committee because in 2018, when we got around to dealing with the specific lessons on gender identity, I proposed a motion that we only use in the curriculum, that we only use terms that would match biology lessons in 9th grade and others, so that we only use the term biological sex and not sex assigned at birth, because sex isn't assigned. You don't get a doctor sprinkling the wrong color of fairy dust on a child. It's pink or blue, but they might have made a mistake. It doesn't work that way. The doctor doesn't technically you assign, but you recognize the sex that the child has. So it's not assigned, and it's not at birth. It happens at conception. This is what we teach at, in our biology classes. So, and I also tried to phrase a very carefully worded, just a general sense of, if we're going to teach about gender transition, mention that concept, then we need to also include, like we do for other things, such as if we teach about sex, and we teach that you might have these different consequences if you do this. If you do XYZ, you might end up with this nasty disease, XYZ. Or, we teach that. We teach that if you make certain choices, we recommend against that choice, but if you make this choice, then there's this consequence potentially. So my thought was, let's add something in there that if we're going to teach about the concept of transition to middle schoolers, there needs to be something in there that says, this is not recognized, or this is not fully understood, it's still experimental, there are consequences physically, socially, emotionally. Well, you would have thought like all hell broke loose. That was like, my motion was tabled to the next meeting. And by the next meeting, I had been thrown off the committee, and I was replaced with this sort of a Democratic Party activist, basically, who kind of swaggered in and said, biological sex is meaningless. Every major medical organization recognizes the concept that it's sex assigned at birth, and the whole committee kind of, worshipped and bowed down and passed this. And it was a very interesting process because they actually, I had worked with these people for like 3.5 years. And I said, could I have 3 minutes, which is the typical amount of time, to speak to the motion that I made, And out of 33 people, I think 7 people raised their hand to let me speak for 3 minutes to the motion that I had made. Because you can come back and watch these meetings. They're public meetings. And by then there were so many parents in the room with me to watch what happened that they had to move the meeting to another venue because people were pretty outraged that I'd gotten kicked off so summarily. But it's a volunteer position. You're supposed to be able to serve out your term. But they got rid of me pretty quickly. And then that, of course, the terminology. So 7 people asked for me to be able to speak. Of course, the motion didn't pass. And I sat there thinking, this is how it must feel in sort of a totalitarian system where I was looking around the table and thinking, I know not all these people think it's a bad idea to actually discuss that. These are teachers. We're supposed to be a premier school system in the country. And they're all too cowed by the activists in the room or by the potential on their career. They're too cowed to even allow 3 minutes of discussion on this. Because I had time to make my statement the previous meeting that was it. And I thought this is how terrible things happen. Terrible policies, terrible laws go through because you get a few people that have dominated the narrative that impose consequences if you speak up. And it's too costly to say something, and therefore you're going to pass what everyone knows is not real language, not real accurate medical language, but you're going to pass something to please the ideologists because there's too great of a cost to speak up.
Why do you think the sexualization of children is a priority for your particular school board and other school boards around the country? Why is that so important for them to achieve the destruction of innocence and the implantation of false reality into youth?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think it varies from person to person. I think some of it's well-intentioned. Oddly, I think some people are under the delusion that somehow these kids benefit from having all this information. A lot of it's just not age appropriate. Sometimes it's kids. Sometimes parents are. Sometimes I think a lot of people pushing this stuff may not be parents themselves. They're young ideologists. They're very active sexually. They want people to throw off the chains, the repressive chains
of stable society.
Yeah, and maybe they would say of stable society, certainly of things like marriage. Like, what's the point of marriage? What's the point of, any sort of kind of really that sort of sexual free-for-all? And so, I think it's where do you stop? You have to let people, there have to be norms. Kids actually do much better with boundaries and norms. And if you start teaching them things like, it really doesn't matter. And it's also, I'm just trying to think back to your question. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I can certainly say in our school board, there are certainly some members that are actively pushing this stuff because it's what they believe in, they're involved in. They'll do just about anything to get it through. So, I could point to some individuals, but in this particular case, the person who's the worst on our school board right now wasn't on the school board back then. But I think there's such, I mean, it shouldn't be a bipartisan issue, because I know that voters of both parties and parents are concerned about this, but somehow there's, in our school board and in our district, there's a very strong LGBTQ push of anything that stands, any stand you take to try to mitigate the level and quantity and type of information that gets taught to kids is viewed as bigotry. So there's a very strong capture, I mean, from the top level, the Democratic Party on down, to this stuff.
Yeah.
And lots of money, honestly. I mean, the schools get a lot of money from, believe it or not, their resource for adoption in our curriculum was Planned Parenthood, a separate issue. But I mean, come on, who goes to Planned Parenthood for adoption? So there's a very, that was one of the things we like if you want to offer kids genuine options, you can't just at later points in the curriculum. But it's the same thing. Planned Parenthood, guess who gives out all kinds of hormones? Planned Parenthood. So you have this sort of, there really is a school to gender treatment pipeline there. Mm-hmm. They benefit, they give curriculum, then who gets referred for hormones, and where? Well, there's money involved, and that's always going to be a push too.
And if we look at individual cases such as this Sage girl, and we see what happens with children who already begin with trauma, with unstable family lives, and then are subjected to this, and then what can happen. So let's go into the Sage case and her story, and see how that might be a test case for how this is a destructive ideology.
Yeah, and that's actually precisely sort of an outworking of these policies that our schools have been working on for these. Fairfax is one of the schools that has this terrible policy, but back in 2021, Governor Northam, who was the Democratic governor at the time, worked with the first transgender advocate delegate in the House and the Assembly, and a lot of other people who really wanted to have these policies in our schools in Virginia that protect supposedly transgender kids. And a fundamental piece of that is the parental notification piece, where if the child requests that the school not disclose to the parents that they want to identify as the opposite sex, that the school will go along with that request, because supposedly, again, like I said, this thread we saw in my committee, supposedly you have to protect the kids from their parents. So we have this narrative, and honestly, you're halfway down the track already to capturing these kids when you start portraying or conveying the idea that, well, here at school, you're safe. You may not be safe at home, but here at school, you're safe. So you recreate and try to move the safe space from the home where your parents have taken care of you for your whole life. Now, they might not let you have everything you ask for, but that doesn't make you unsafe. So you're over in school where we're going to nurture and make sure that you are safe in everything you feel. And that concept of going back to even the committee in our curriculum, it said there was this statement of your identity is what you feel. And I remember going to the curriculum author and saying, if I feel like I need a piece of chocolate cake, does that make me? That's a silly example, but kids at this age feel anything. It's the awful era of feeling everything. I mean, who had a good time in middle school? Who felt good about their body in middle school? I don't know anybody who could say, yeah, I was kind of uncomfortable in my own skin in middle school. Were you? I don't know. Maybe you were the exception.
No, not me.
Yeah. See, I mean, everybody, that's like that awkward, awful phase, but that's the capture time that begins. So these policies put in place this idea that the school is safe, and then it comes along with all this terminology, all this ideology, that your identity, somehow your feelings become immutable, but your biology is fungible. And that's an absurd, that's just an absurd statement, and this is the thing, in order to push that through, you have to have secrecy, because parents aren't going to go along with that for the most part. I mean, you may have parents, you may have kids, and I would say there's categories of things here. There's kids who may have struggled with something from very, very early ages. That's a different category than what we're talking about here by and large, which is adolescence and onset of gender dysphoria in adolescence. I know you've had other people talk about that, but the policies protect kids, create this sort of space where this idea can be nurtured and grown, and it depends in part on secrecy. So that policy in Sage's case, I don't even know if that. Go ahead.
Well, just the underlying assumption is that the children belong to the state, not to the family.
That's right.
The state and the process. No, and not even any individual within the school or the school boards or the activist things have a direct connection to any given individual kid, but the system itself owns everything. And so that's the assumption and that is what makes it totalitarian.
Yeah.
The assumption. Yeah.
That's right. And the hearing for Sage's Law that we had on Monday, the opponents of the bill came forward and said portions of exactly what you're saying. A teacher said, we're trained, let us do our jobs. We're the ones that are going to take care of our kids. Another trans activist comes in and says, parents don't know about the trans experience. Well, neither do you for this particular child, but there's this concept. So going back to Sage's case, these policies that Governor Northam passed, and this was during the time that this happened with Sage, those policies came through in 2021 that would allow a school to establish an entire transition team of specialists, for these kids to transition. So conceivably, you could have a child at school, fully transition socially at school for 4 years and never tell the parent about it. But what is interesting about Appomattox, which is where the school was that Sage was in, it's this little rural red county in Virginia. It's not a blue county. I don't even know. And from what I understand, they've been deluged with media inquiries about this. I don't even know if parents in that school were aware of what the policy was on this. There's no policy posted on the school board. The school board hasn't answered media calls. Nobody's answering media calls. There's no public policy available. Now in Fairfax there is, and it was controversial, but it passed because it's all Democratic run in the school board. But Appomattox is deep red Virginia, and yet somehow still that school, the counselors in the school were going by essentially the Northam policies, which went along with this parental lack of notification. So in 2021, Sage started school. She had been in a smaller school in 2021. She started at that school. And as you mentioned, she's a child who had already spent early infancy in 6 different foster homes. Her mother now, Michelle, is her biological grandmother. Her son died when Sage was 6 months old. And her grandmother immediately started the adoption process, but it was, you have to jump through a lot of hoops, and it was interstate, so there was a lot to get through. So by the time Sage came to her, she'd been in the foster care system for about a year and a half, over a year for sure. And so people that are familiar with adoption and with foster care know that there's even in early infancy, there's some pretty serious trauma that can emerge later. And when she first came, I have a lot of friends who have families through adoption and on. There's a very common theme here where kids come in and they don't cry. They self-soothe because they've learned that no one cares, no one listens. They don't hold on to toys because they've learned that if you are given a toy, it gets taken away again. So there's a lot to to love through a child who's been there. So when Sage came home with Michelle and Roger, her grandparents, she was their only child because she was their biological grandparent. And they, early childhood, it seems really, Sage really blossomed. She grew. She was a happy little girl. She was curious. She played the piano. She did poetry. She did art, all this. But then when puberty started, and that was during the COVID lockdowns too, everything kind of went south. And everything at school was all about these cool ideas of being bi and emo and trans. Yeah. And Sage, was kind of a quirky, quiet kid and wanted to make friends. And in hindsight now, she says that's really what was motivating this. So she's sort of unpacked her feelings now. But when she started school in August of 2021, she was just coming off a summer of some pretty severe, she'd even been inpatient for a while with just severe depression, anxiety. She'd been under treatment for a while. She had started a different protocol. So this is all kind of part of typical treatment for a lot of kids for depression and anxiety. And that you have to closely monitor.
Hold on. I lost your...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, there we go. You're back.
Okay, sorry.
So this is the protocol?
So a protocol, when you change or you adjust, when you're on medications for depression or anxiety, part of what you have to closely monitor is potential effects. I mean, we know some of these medications for suicide actually make suicide ideation worse, right? I'm not for suicide, but I said that wrong. Some of these medications that you are given for depression or anxiety can, for some children, make it worse. And so you have to you really need involvement, somebody who's watching, just to be sure that the medication is doing what it's supposed to. So, I mean, that's just part of the picture, but those are the sorts of reasons that for kids who are vulnerable, you cannot leave parents out of the picture. So Sage, unfortunately, was one of these kids, and she started school. Michelle filled out the report to the school with information about about the protocol, with information about Sage's history of mental health issues, under the assumption that, like her previous school, they would keep her in the loop and communicate with her about what was going on. Well, Sage told, when she started school, so this is, mid-August, she told the school that she was now a boy, and she wanted to be named Draco, and she wanted to have male pronouns used. And
Draco?
That was the name she chose. This is all part of the whole, I guess, emo.
Yeah, I guess. Better than Joffrey.
Yeah.
If you're going to pick a villain.
She's a 14-year-old kid with an imagination. This is what she picked. So,
yeah.
So she started school, and she asked the school counselor at some point during the hallway when she met her, if I'm identifying, or I'm a boy, can I use the boys' bathroom? And the school counselor said, yeah, if you're identifying as a boy, you can use the boys' bathroom.
Why would she want to use the boys' bathroom?
Well, because she's identifying as a boy. This is part of what you do, right? This is part of coming across as a boy.
We'll get to the consequences of that, but she doesn't understand that she's not a boy, and the boys are going to make that very clear very quick.
That's right. And that's, you hear a lot, you've heard a lot. Sage's story is kind of the sort of tragic case of what can happen with a girl in a boy's bathroom, which should be obvious to the most, commonsensical of school officials, especially in a rural area like Appomattox, right?
And middle school. I mean, they're jackals.
In middle school. I know. Right? They're hormones on feet. I mean, that's just the way it works, too. And so they, you hear a lot about, what is the risk to girls and women of having biological males in their spaces, but people haven't really focused on the flip side of that. And this girl is 95 pounds soaking wet. I mean, she's little. Yeah. So, she's told that she can use, this is what she told her mom after she said, Nana, I would never have used that bathroom without asking. I asked the school counselor in the hallway the first week that I met her.
Okay. And the school counselor didn't think through this.
Well, the school
Kind of
counselor gave the
inception.
standard policy answer, which all these policies are pushing. Of course, you use the bathroom identified with your gender, not your biological sex.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, she started to be horribly bullied, and Michelle figured it was because she had started to dress as a boy, and that was part of what it was. But Sage was telling Michelle she was just dressing emo. I mean, her grandfather took her to get her hair dyed blue. They figured, look, kids do this. These are teens. We want her to express herself the way she wants.
The bullying was coming from males or females?
Males. And very much so. There had been an incident on a school bus where there were threats to her that she would get raped and all these sorts of things. And Michelle knew that she had, Michelle asked the school, I forget how that came about, but Michelle knew something had happened and she pushed the school to review recording. There's some footage on the school bus that confirmed she was bullied. It was a little hard to tell exactly all the content of what went on, but so Michelle was aware there was some bullying, but she was never told by the school that Sage was identifying as a boy. So she wasn't given the whole picture. She definitely was not given the whole picture of how severe, she did not have the whole picture. And kids are embarrassed about bullying. They're not going to go home and say, I'm being bullied. So you have to have school and parent participation in these sorts of things, or it can become deadly.
There's just a huge gap of actual oversight and a continuum of oversight. And by oversight, it's their children, and they need to be watched.
Exactly.
And then she also was surrounded and assaulted in the bathroom.
So then what happened? Yes, what happened? So something happened on a Monday, and this was the 23rd of August. So this is about 2 weeks after school starts. And the school becomes aware. There are reports that start flying around. The school starts finding out the way the school records phrase it, because I reviewed the school records they asked for. There's some interesting things that are omitted, or, I don't know exactly. There's a lot there that will, I think, probably eventually be discussed. Let's put it that way. But,
and do you get a feeling that, because this gender ideology and the tiptoeing around, I guess opacity, there's not transparency, so we have to start to use language that's inexact or obfuscates certain details, and then that once a little bit of that happens, then it just starts to corrupt truth.
There's a domino effect. Because if you acknowledge that you are treating this child as a boy, then the question is, what do you mean? In what ways? And then if you acknowledge that your policy is to let a tiny girl use a boy's bathroom in rural Virginia, then people are going to say, are you out of your minds? And they know this. And so then what happens on Monday? So it's a domino effect. One secret, and I have teens. I've watched a lot of CW shows, because with them, The Flash and all, and the storyline, when there is a lie to protect the other person that you love, supposedly, in any storyline, that always ends in disaster. There's a reason for that, because one lie builds on another. And yet the characters keep doing it. And I feel like these school officials are like I don't know, it's like they're playing this out. How many kids have to be hurt before they figure out lies lead to terrible things?
Well, when you get up into the echelons of authority, who's pushing this, which would be the Democratic Party and the school boards, and the school unions, which are entirely connected. It's one huge blob all the way throughout the government. It's just an extension of the government. And you reference that cowardice to stand up, to speak the truth, right? And then so many different layers of opportunities to wash your hands. Well, I just told a little lie over here. Right. Oh, that's an unfortunate case down there. Oh, that boy wasn't really transgender when he was raping. He was before and after, but not during the rape. He was a male. So, how do we, we have to... Right.
Exactly. It builds on itself.
Yeah.
So something happens in that bathroom on that Monday. The school gets wind of, apparently there were teachers calling in, there were students, there were other parents that must have heard from their students that something happened. This is Monday. Nobody tells Michelle. Tuesday, the school counselor pulls Sage in and asks what happened. And it's not very clear what happened. She's distraught. She doesn't want to say anything. So the counselor, but she makes a comment, all the boys in this school are rapists. So according to the counselor's notes, that sets off, a little bit of concern for her. No. So she then she calls the school resource officer in to review the footage, and they look at the time when Sage was in the bathroom because they have hallway footage. And sure enough, there's a group of boys that go in while Sage is in that bathroom. So still without calling Michelle, they call her in the next day on Wednesday. They call Sage in and put her on the spot. The school resource officer says, here's this 14-year-old kid who's already kind of,
did they also
a mess
interview the boys?
They seem to have interviewed the boys at some point. I'm not sure at what point. But part of the problem was they've also interviewed the boys about the school bus incident and others, and nobody really gets into trouble. They, you have a conversation about, well, how would you feel in their shoes, kind of thing. And of course, they're lying about having threatened or said anything or who said what or whatever. So Sage is also caught in the scenario of, it's her word against all these boys. And she's a freshman. She's a 14-year-old freshman. She doesn't have really friends yet. And so so that Wednesday afternoon, the school resource, she's got the police officer and the school counselor. And even she denies it. According to the school counselor's notes, she denies that, something happened. There's this whole discussion about, there were threats. There's this whole discussion about it. Yeah.
Okay. So she's interviewed by the counselor and the police officer.
With the police officer. But
and
still,
she
no one has
denies.
mentioned. She denies, according to the school counselor's notes, there's a back and forth, so it's not really clear she denies. She goes back and forth. I mean, there's sort of a whole, there's a whole discussion. It's not really clear what the whole content of the discussion is, and that's something that'll have to be, because these are the school counselor's notes too. But as part of that discussion, and she says, I didn't even want to talk about any of this, is one of the statements she makes to the counselors, and she denies that she was raped.
Hold on. Okay. So she is in a interview with the school counselor and the police officer. It's a confusing or Byzantine back and forth, and she denies that she was raped. Yes.
I think I'm not even sure. It's a complicated back and forth. So it's not, I would say she denies, according to the school counselor's notes, she denies that. And then there's even, according to the school counselor's notes, the school counselor actually tells her that if you make false claims of rape against these boys, some wealthy boys, you need to always tell the truth. Some wealthy boys' families could sue you. So here's this kid, and this is a common thing for assault survivors to fear that they won't be hurt. So even in this conversation with this troubled 14-year-old girl who's already not thinking straight on all kinds of levels. I mean, she's lying to her parents. She's asked the school to lie for her parents, to her parents about this. Who knows what is, she's confused. She's distraught. She's told that she could get sued if she makes false accusations, by the school counselor with the police officer standing there. And they're telling her, we want to protect you. But then they're also telling her these things. And apparently this conversation goes south to the point where she's just completely distraught. And that's the point where they call in Michelle and ask her to come pick her up. So for the first time since Monday, when this is whatever happened and these different interviews, without her mom, even if they suspected a potential rape or assault, without her mom, they have all these conversations with a 14-year-old minor, and then finally they decide, well, now she's such a mess, we're going to call the mom.
Okay.
So that's Michelle picks her up, and she's distraught, and this is Wednesday, August 25th. And at that point, that evening after school, Michelle found a hall pass that was labeled Draco. So she went and asked Sage about it. And that's when Sage, not the school, Sage asked, Sage told her, yeah, Mom, that's my name at school. I'm going, I'm identifying as a boy. And so Michelle, one thing I should mention is that Michelle is a trained CASA, as they call it, court-appointed special advocate. And so she's had training and background checks and for years had worked with teens in the foster care system. A CASA is somebody who goes in as kind of as a friend and a bit of a volunteer, sort of outside friend involved in the process who can have a chance to befriend a child and have a bit better sense of what's going on and advocate for them with the court. So she's well aware of how various aspects of terrible trauma manifest in kids and how to listen, how not to go nuts when somebody says something and all. So she has this conversation sitting on the floor with Sage where they're talking, and Sage, Michelle told me it was kind of like I asked her when I was writing documenting her story, because there's so many pieces of this. It was a process over weeks, actually months. And I asked her, was Sage crying? Were you crying? And she said, well, I wasn't, because I just wanted to be calm and try to help. And she said Sage was trying to hold back the tears, but crying. It was kind of like when she was a baby, where she just didn't, she doesn't cry a lot because there's this instinct that it won't matter anyways. So she's trying to hold back tears, and she's describing to her mom that she was jacked up by these boys in the boys' bathroom and threatened.
What do you mean jacked up?
Like taken by the throat and pushed up against the wall.
Okay.
I think that's what she meant. And they were surrounding her, and Michelle still doesn't know if, Michelle still doesn't know exactly what happened in that bathroom. Certainly the legal definition of assault. And I feel perfectly comfortable. That's one of the things that we talked about. There's no question in my mind, having read the records, and there were texts flying around. So after Sage ran away, then the counselors and everybody were trying to interview students and find out what might have happened. And there are texts from that time.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let's try to organize the. So she speaks with Michelle, which is the adopted mother and the grandmother of Sage.
Right.
Sits her down, tries to understand what happened. Sage is emotional, but holding it back. Michelle does get some information out of her about her gender identity switch and about the treatment that she's received from the boys at school. Right. And then what happens?
So at that point, Michelle thought, so that's when she also talks a little bit more about, I think, the level of bullying that she had. Michelle still didn't find out the depth of that until conversations with Sage much, much later. And it turns out that they were following her in the hall. They were shoving her. There was an incident apparently in the hall where she might have been shoved up against the wall by the boys. They were touching her, threatening her. So it was even worse than what Michelle understood at the time from that conversation with Sage on the floor. But it was certainly enough that Michelle said, stay home. We'll figure this out. Don't go back to school. We will figure this out, because obviously it was a major issue.
Yeah.
And she thought that, okay, we've talked about it. We have a plan for, we'll stay home. We'll figure it out. Well, that was the night that Sage disappeared. And Michelle the next morning came into her room, and there was a note that was eventually found that talked about how Sage was afraid of what would happen if she stayed. And there were bad people around, and she wanted her parents to be careful too. And it sounded like some of the threats might have gone to things these boys might do to the parents. I don't know. But, there's question marks there. But basically she disappeared, and she had met somebody online that she thought was a 16-year-old friend she could go skateboarding with or something. So she snuck out to meet this friend. And unfortunately, it wasn't a friend. It was a predator who had lured her online. And she was picked up by this man. And this was a girl who'd barely thought about dating up to this point. And she was picked up, and then the sequence of horrific events for the next 9 days, she disappeared, and she was raped. She was taken over into first Washington, D.C., and then Maryland over a period of days, locked up, drugged, gang raped by more men than there's so much trauma there. There are no numbers even. It was so bad. Locked up in a room and brought to this home in Maryland where to the home of a known sex offender where they were seemingly there's terms for this, I guess, but seasoning her is the term to be part of this sex trafficking ring where they wear you down psychologically, they beat you, they sexually abuse you in all kinds of horrific ways to ensure that you're just basically completely compliant. But as a 14-year-old girl, I mean, just this tiny little innocent girl that, lived through this horror at this point, because there was essentially, there was just a complete breakdown. And you're not thinking rationally at age 14. So that was.
How did she escape?
So as soon as she disappeared, Michelle, of course, the sheriff got involved, the FBI. I mean, everybody took it very, very seriously. Michelle said she could hardly breathe. She said when she saw the search and rescue dogs be called in, she knew that they were worried about the worst. She said she just, from 1 minute to the next, kept thinking she was going to get a call that they'd found a body. And so they got a call late at night, 10 p.m. On a Thursday night from 9 days after she disappeared, that the FBI had found her in this home of this sex offender in Maryland, and they'd arrested the guy, and it was a whole ring. So there's a series of trials. That first guy has now been tried in November, and there will be other trials related to that because it's not
tried and found
guilty. He's guilty, but
guilty
only
of what?
Well, in that case, I'd have to go read the documents exactly, right. but it involves minors. It involved. Not just one. So they're a little cagey about sharing all of it. But there are multiple men and there are multiple victims who are minors. So the information stays pretty close. But what I'm relating to you is, so he was convicted in Maryland, but there will be subsequent trials involving the group that I believe will take place in D.C.
And is it accurate enough to say that they are using online chat forums to find vulnerable children?
Absolutely.
Okay. And those online forums probably have something to do with LGBTQ.
They do.
Trans stuff through forums. In the article, you mentioned Roblox, which is this cheesy little game that
my kids play it all the time.
Yeah. Okay.
Why do you need to hide the screen? I mentioned this in my article, but there's a panic button, hide the screen from your parents. Why do you need to hide the screen from your parents?
Because you're not safe.
Right.
In your identity, and your parents might not give you that. And these friends on the internet are 16 who are right there with you, who you've never met and you don't know who you are or who they are. They are your real friends. And that situation is made valid by the schools doing the exact same thing. So the schools are saying you belong to us, and then the internet says you belong to us too. We are your real family. We'll send you the hormones. I mean, even this person Keffels online brags about sending minors hormones and stuff like that. And it's all a continuum, and within that continuum or within that behavior is a huge opportunity for the worst element in society to go hog wild. So, and by the worst element, I mean two things: those sexual abusers and stuff, and then the totalitarian state.
That's right.
They're both taking advantage of this, and by separating the children from one reality of their bodies and their parents.
That's right. That's an excellent way to put it. That's right. Well, and I think you've had Erin Friday on your show before. But she is the one who, she's talked about this, and it's seen on others. She, after her daughter put female to male on her social media, immediately there were suspicious accounts popping up and contacting her. And so if all this is happening in secret from a parent, and so that the female to male particularly, these are young girls, vulnerable girls, they're online because they may not have a lot of friends. That is the ideal pick for a sexual predator and sex trafficker. Because that child is already vulnerable enough to have been captured by this idea that I will be happier if I become a boy, which is the complete snake oil that has been sold to these kids. But that's so they've already been captured by that. They probably don't have a lot of friends, and they're that much more vulnerable to this. And the first rule of a predator is, number one, don't tell your parents. And secondly,
it's our little
what you
secret.
said, they might, exactly. They might not be safe, but I am. And they might not love you, but I do.
We do. So, we love you.
Yeah, that's
You're
right.
our children, our little children.
That's right. So that was very much, and if you have a child who's already vulnerable, and as you said, the school is playing right into this. In fact, later on in the story, the second time this happened, the transgender, the site that...
Oh, wait, hold on. Wait. Yeah. Second time this happened. So let's get to that. Sure. Let's go back to the chronology. Sage is found, brought back to her adopted mother and grandfather.
No. Sage is not brought back to her adopted mother and grandfather. That is what should have happened. Okay. Sage is in Maryland, and she is held at a girls' detention center in Maryland near Baltimore. The FBI called Michelle and Roger at 10 p.m. at night. They said, come pick her up first thing in the morning. So Michelle and Roger stay up all night packing the car with blankets and pillows and stuffed animals and Sage's favorite snack, so that in the back seat, so that they can bring her home and, start to just help her recover from this unspeakable ordeal.
Okay.
So they drive through the night. It's several hours away to get up to Baltimore for them. They drive through the night. They get there by 8 a.m., an hour before the detention center even opens. So at 9 o'clock, they show up to get her, and they say, we're here to pick up Sage. And there's a little window in the door doesn't open. The lady's really cold behind it. And she says, no, you can't have her. I was like, what do you mean we can't have her? We're her parents. And they said, no, you can't have her. You have to go to Judge Kershaw's chambers at 4 o'clock that afternoon, 7 hours later. And they say, well, could we just see her? Could we just give her a hug? And they're like, nope. They don't even tell Sage that they're there for her. This little girl who's been through this abominable ordeal and is in a jail cell, locked up by herself. So they can't figure out what in the world is going on, but they wait in front of the courtroom for that whole day, having driven through the night, no sleep, thought they could get their daughter. So they show up in the courtroom at 4 o'clock that afternoon, end of a work week on a Friday afternoon. And Judge Kershaw, and Sage isn't even in the courtroom. She's on this giant Zoom screen in a detention cell. And, Michelle says, Sage, I love you. And Sage says, Nana, I love you too. And that's when this public defender, Anissa Khan, an assistant public defender from Maryland, steps up. She's in person in the courtroom, and she said, that is not Sage, that is Draco, and his pronouns are he and his. And Michelle and Roger are like, what? They're floored. Okay. And they try to adapt, and this defender on Sage's behalf is alleging that Michelle and Roger have physically and emotionally abused Sage, or Draco, in connection with his expressed male identity and desire to live as a male. So they're blindsided with this. They just think they're coming to pick up their traumatized child. And so suddenly they're in another universe and trying to say, okay, well, they're willing to call, they're not even hung up on the name or pronouns at all. They just want to get their child home.
Yeah.
And so they try.
What does Sage want? Is Sage expressed a desire to return home?
We don't know what happened in that conversation between Sage and her defender, because her defender is alleging certain things that later on Sage will say she told her to lie about. So I don't know that there's any way of knowing what happened what Sage actually said. The defender is alleging physical and emotional abuse. So basically what he sends them home, and they keep Sage in that detention center for about a week. There's a series all told over the next 2 months. So from that Friday afternoon on September 3rd, there's a series of 17 hearings total, for 2.5 months or so. And a lot of those have to do with whether Sage gets returned to Virginia. So now there are these allegations of abuse that have to be dealt with. Yeah. So, which again, Michelle was a CASA. She already had a background check. It doesn't take all that long to clear Michelle and Roger of abuse charges in both states. But it gives grounds for the judge to hold on for custody to be withheld, and they keep her in Maryland. Under the Interstate Compact on Juveniles, which is what governs, it's a pretty well-established body of law that all 50 states are party to, you are supposed to return a runaway, even if it's a runaway juvenile, and even if there are allegations of abuse, so spurious or not, you are supposed to return that child to their home state, because the home state is presumed to better be able to assess whether there's any grounds for the abuse charges, right?
Okay.
The judge refuses to return her at all.
Why?
He keeps, well, that's an excellent question. He keeps holding hearings.
Do you think he's safer than the other state?
He keeps holding hearings as to whether the requisition is even to be allowed or can be contested, and even at the end of that too, after he's already gone on record saying that he can no longer withhold the custody, he grants an emergency stay of motion that this public defender, Anissa Khan, is filing to still hold on to Sage on the grounds of abuse. There's no question.
And why does Ms. Khan want to keep Sage under her purview? Like, why do they want this girl so much? Are they better able to care for her?
Well, that seems to be the very clear presumption under all of their actions. That's why they keep her because supposedly she's unsafe with her parents. So, and there's multiple references, even this sort of arrogance, I think it's arrogant, end of the case sort of lecture that the judge adds to his final order, saying, well, they do have custody, they've been cleared of abuse, but it's likely that emotional abuse occurred, and they must love her, but all this abuse took place related to her, likely abuse took place related to her misgendering. Desire to live as, it's very clear. So this whole time,
so far as you know from Michelle's account, Michelle didn't even have a chance to misgender.
That's right.
Because she didn't know that was happening, and once she found out that very night, Sage ran away.
Right.
And so, I don't understand how a judge, of all people, would not see that. Well, maybe the defender created a narrative to...
That's right. So he's providing a forum this whole time for the defender to build a case of abuse on the grounds of misgendering. And it's very clear. We have texts from Sage at the time going by Draco, and then she switched to being Justin at some point in Maryland. But going by her boy identity, she texts a friend and says, well, she told me, or this case is going all the way to appeals in the Supreme Court. She wants to win, but it's not going to affect me anyways because it's not going to change anything for me. Something to that effect. So clearly... And she tells her mother later, like I said, eventually at the end of all this, she tells her that attorney Anissa Khan had told her to lie so she could prove abuse charges and have her taken away and have her put in a foster care home in Maryland that would affirm her male identity. So she told her to lie, to say anything about abuse that would enable her to make the case. She also told her, because Sage was eventually exposed to street drugs and all there, she said, I don't care about the drugs. I just want this case. I just want to win this case. So it's very clear that this attorney was absolutely intent on building a case of abuse on the grounds of misgendering and taking it all the way to the Supreme Court. So this judge...
Probably to make her own name. Like, this is her shot.
Is there any other conclusion? I mean, this judge and this attorney, in my opinion, are building a legal record. They're trying to make legal history and build a legal record on the pieces of this girl's body and soul. I mean, this is like a broken child, but what they see is opportunity to make legal history.
Okay. So, and just to really focus on the chronology. So, over the course of these 17 hearings, you said 2 months or 5 months. Where was Sage? Let's just go through where Sage was over the course.
For that first week after the hearing on September 3rd, Sage was in a detention center, and her mother pleaded for her to be sent somewhere for treatment, and the judge just said, I don't want to hear that word trauma again. He never once, this is one of the things that's so appalling about the whole thing, he never once treats her as a victim of sex trafficking. He treats her as a runaway delinquent so he can hold on to her. So there's kind of this is kind of the technicality of the legal bit, so that he can, if she's a runaway, it's a bit of a different classification than if she's just a victim. So she's, I'm inferring motive here, but it's hard to infer otherwise. And I'm outside of the case, so it doesn't matter anyways. But that's my read of it. My read of it is that there's a pretty clear sequence of events here. Did he think he was doing the right thing? I have to think so, but, maybe, I don't know. So after a week, he assigns her to a children's home in Maryland. And she's put there, but because the judge is affirming her male identity, he orders her housed in male quarters of this children's home for foster kids in care of the state.
Okay.
Because it's according to her expressed male identity. And again, what could go wrong? Any person of common sense, a foster care home, a children's home is going to be where there are kids who are already probably have a history of, delinquency, being on the streets. They're in foster care for a reason. You put a 95-pound girl in there, what's going to happen? So she does get assaulted. She later on tells her mom she just kept, she gets assaulted multiple times. They put her in her own room, but she still gets treated this way. They send her to school, a school out there. They don't apparently even so Michelle's trying to, not once during this period did Michelle's communications to her get through, according to Sage. So she's in for this 2-month period of time. At this home, she starts going to school there. She's got at some point they don't monitor her very well because makes friends that give her drugs, and, she's making friends up there. And the reason they're not telling Michelle any of this, they know that she's failing drug tests. I guess they have to administer drug tests. Michelle doesn't find out about any of this whole time. And she's sending letters and calling. She asks the court if she can do that. They say yes. But somehow none of those letters or phone calls ever make it to Sage, even on her birthday. So in the meantime, and this is what Sage, again, at the end of the story tells her mom, she said attorney Anissa Khan told her that her mom didn't want her anymore because she was identifying as a boy. So her mom didn't want her anymore. So, she was going to step in, and obviously she was helping her win the case. She was going to find her a foster home that would affirm her as a boy. Okay. So imagine telling a little girl, essentially that's what she is, that after that horrific experience that she went through, her mom doesn't want her anymore. Plus her mom doesn't want her because she's a boy. So, the cruelty of that to me is just mind-boggling. And, there's all kinds of, we know this about survivors of sexual exploitation. There's all kinds of shame and guilt and you blame yourself for things that happened to you. And so it's not a stretch. I don't know. This is why I say we do not know what happened in that initial conversation where, the public defender comes out and tells the judge that Sage doesn't want to go home and that she's being abused emotionally and physically. Because I don't know what actually happened in that conversation. And
Okay, so
that,
after 2 months in this children's home and going to school, getting involved in drugs, what happens after
So
2 months?
during this whole period, Michelle is fighting madly to get her daughter back. And she agrees she says, let's have her go to a treatment facility. If she doesn't want to come home, will you sign off on a treatment facility for her? So she finds one fairly quickly that the Virginia services approved by mid-October. I mean, it's not fairly quickly, but by mid-October. And in the meantime, they're being cleared of these abuse charges. But she finds a treatment facility for her that she wants. But it's a treatment facility and it's for kids, sexually exploited kids. It's a group named Youth for Tomorrow that's approved by the Virginia Social Services. But it treats girls who are youth, but it would treat her as a girl who was sexually exploited, which of course is what she is. So Anissa Khan and the judge refuse this because it's not a facility that will affirm her as a boy. So then they're scrambling to find a facility that supposedly will. And according to Michelle, there's back and forth with services in Virginia that offer a number of different options. The judge and the defender don't want to approve any of them because they're not going to house her and treat her as a boy. So finally, they find one, North Spring in Virginia, that will treat her as a boy. But it's not just a treatment facility for victims, it's a locked treatment facility, and these are some of the kids that have the highest risk behaviors. So, and it's a facility where 2 years ago, a kid died in a chokehold. And originally, when Khan was just trying to keep, when she was trying to keep Sage in Maryland, she had scared her by showing her this article in the Washington Post that talked about this teen who died in a chokehold at North Spring. So we don't want to go there. Well, eventually, that's the only one that will affirm her as male. So finally, there's a court order on, I think it's November 10th, that awards custody back to the parents, and this long lecture about how they're probably misgendering, they're probably abusing her. But he has absolutely no grounds. I mean, we're way past that point, but he's got absolutely no grounds to hold her anymore. And as I mentioned, under that compact, even with allegations of abuse, once a requisition is filed, you're supposed to return the child within 5 days. So we're way past 5 days
and
here.
Is there any, so I guess you already said that Michelle had a hard time finding representation, but right. Is there any legal recourse to sue a judge for this, or to sue the attorney, or I guess you sue the state? The judge can just act like this and without any consequences.
Well, we'll see. I think that there are very much efforts in play to address some of those issues. So, the Gavel Project is heading up all that. There's definitely litigation on the way. And I think there's some very motivated litigators to try to see that justice is obtained, because it's unconscionable. I mean, obviously all the facts everybody has to be heard on this, but this was really the case of the little, it's every mom, not every man necessarily, but every mom against just the tyranny of the bureaucracy and it's, the little guy against the entire establishment, just and unbelievable harm coming from it. But, it's really a story too of a mom who wouldn't quit, because even in the face of all of this, she just kept fighting for her child. So yes, I mean, the part of what was going on was that the judge was, I think, part of what was going on was the judge was claiming on technicalities, this requisition isn't filed properly. They're done differently in Virginia. So the first thing, as you can imagine, Michelle did was go back and get a requisition order, but it was, filed by this person instead of that person or whatever. There's reasons that have been come up with, for various reasons, technicalities like that at the beginning. But then I think the requisition was approved in every last little dot, at least, I want to say, it was weeks before the judge finally released her. So, that I think those questions are going to get sorted out in court, and they should be. So,
just to try to make it as linear as possible. Yes. So 2 months in a children's home where she's being treated like a boy, going to school. And not treated for any trauma.
Yeah.
Not treated for any trauma, so no
Nothing.
psychologist. There's just kind of...
Oh, actually, thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. During this time, guess who makes a reappearance? The school counselors. So the school counselor who had maybe met with her once or twice in those first 2 weeks, a counselor named Avery Villa, back in those first 2 weeks, had met with her. And Michelle, at the time, signed off on it because he was connected with a group that had already been treating her daughter before then. So she thought, okay, sure, we can, keep seeing her. So, but of course, Sage had only been in school for 2 weeks, so neither of her school counselors had time to get to know her in any substantial way at all. Guess who appears in court in mid-October to testify against Michelle for them to have custody? Those two school counselors, the one who had told her daughter that, the one who had interviewed her daughter with the resource officer, and then this other guy, Avery Villa. And Michelle's shocked, and she's like, you guys, you never even had a conversation with me about any of this. How could you possibly know what I think or how I'm treating her? So they're going entirely on whatever Sage asked them to say early on, or, they asked her not to share the fact that Sage was identifying as a boy back then. So, and on top, so at that point, and Michelle didn't know, but apparently it seems like there was some counseling going on of Avery Villa with Sage by Zoom, maybe. So at that point, when Michelle realizes that he's actually testifying against her, she says she doesn't, she takes away, she writes his organization and says, please take him away and stop his counseling my daughter. If seemingly he even told her that she didn't need her medication anymore and these sorts of things. Like, these are just things and Michelle was appalled. He's not a psychiatrist. He wasn't even a licensed counselor yet. He was just, starting his training. But despite her written revocation of his right to see Sage, they continue letting him, Zoom with her, and seemingly, again, according to what I heard from Michelle and Sage, some of the websites that he gave Sage in support of transgender issues linked her up with some of these predators. I'm sure not intentionally. Of course, he wasn't intending that, but some of these websites somehow connected or are tracked by predators. And one of them befriended her. Again, I'm a 16-year-old friend. Come stay with me. And so, whether that was somehow some of those, that seems to be, there seems to be a link between those sites and then the next chapter in Sage's story. But just to go back to the linear part, so Sage is held from September 3 on for about a week in detention center. Then she goes to foster care for about 2 months. She's attending school there. Her case is working its way through. She realizes she's going to have to go. The judge awards custody to the parents and orders her sent to the facility, to this North Spring locked facility that she's scared of, on November 10th. So she realizes that all this is coming down the pike. She has no way of knowing, seemingly, that her mother actually wants her. She doesn't even know Michelle's been trying to get her back. She hasn't received any of the letters. She's been told by Con that her mother doesn't want her anymore. So she decides her best bet is to try to run away. She's scared of being locked up. Her mom doesn't want her, in her mind. And so she, by then I guess she was 15, with the mind of a 15-year-old, decides that somehow it's a better option to run away. So she has a GPS monitor from the court, and while she actually enlists the help of a math teacher from the school that she's going to, tells him she's going to run away. Another friend knows that she's going to run away, and there are texts substantiating this from that time period. And so he hides her backpack. Apparently, he hides her backpack in his closet and says, "Just come tell me goodbye after school." So she goes to school that final day. She gets her backpack, says goodbye to her math teacher, gets help from a friend to snip off her GPS bracelet, and runs away. And Michelle doesn't find out. So she gets a call that her daughter has run away. She didn't come home after school. And so, of course, she's frantic. She's livid at the lack of oversight and at a teacher even help. And that part she didn't find out till later. But she can't believe this has happened again. they were making arrangements for Sage's transportation back to North Spring, and Michelle was figuring, we'll get her back to Virginia, and then we'll sort it out. So the detectives are called in. This is, I think it's about the, I want to say 12th maybe of November, around there. It's right after it's shortly after the hearing. So Sage knew she was going to have to go. And so she runs away, and the detectives are called in. They are able to figure out that she's on a bus going out to Texas, thinking she's meeting this friend. Texas marshals jump into action. They actually catch the guy who's waiting for her at the bus. But Sage realizes that something must have happened, and she just gets off the bus. She's a smart kid. She may be confused in other areas, but she's a really smart kid. So she sneaks off the bus somehow, and then late that night, she's wandering around somewhere in Dallas. I think it was in Dallas. It was one of the cities. And some guy offers her a meal, and then after that, she disappears for months. And this turns out to be another person who was a predator, who exploited her, who locked her up, drugged her, beat her. I don't want to go into too many details, but it was a couple months of just horror again for her. And they were and the irony, this is the thing, one of the things that I just find so incredible is that there would have been a way at some point to track her, because a person thinking that they were being helpful at some point gave Sage a phone, not realizing that this was a child in danger. The Maryland, and somehow then this person, either on a missing child website or something, caught sight of the fact that this was the child she had given a phone to. So she gives permission to Michelle. She says, please have them ping the phone. I had no idea this was going on. And so the marshals in Texas have to have that request to track the phone originate from Maryland. And somehow the Maryland court that was willing to, from all I can see, bend the rules for, weeks and weeks and weeks to keep Sage in Maryland to build this abuse case, while they were building this abuse case, for whatever reason, that request, they won't step out of the box. And they're saying, well, she's not a runaway, or she hasn't committed any crime. They're saying she hasn't committed any crime. We can't track her phone. She's a minor. And there's text traffic back and forth there between the Texas marshals trying to get, the Maryland court order to ping the phone so they can figure out where Sage is. And basically that request just never gets granted. So here we have I doubt that one went to Judge Kershaw, because he's family court, and that would have been probably criminal court. So here's a state willing to bend the rules to keep a child in foster custody where she's being assaulted. And somehow they're not willing to go the extra mile to grant authority to ping a phone that could locate a child caught in the clutches of a sex trafficker. It's just mind-boggling.
Well, assuming that he allowed her to keep the phone. Right.
Yeah. But he may have, because there's some point at which I'm not sure, but I think that could have. I think she did still have the phone. There's some point at which, I don't know if it was allowed access at certain times. There's various things ongoing with that case too in Texas, but that the Texas marshals were actively asking for that because they felt that it would help them locate her, and the court just wouldn't do it. So, but eventually what happens? So she's run away. Texas marshals have told Michelle there's an active sex trafficking pipeline to Mexico. You need to brace yourself that she may already be gone. But Michelle doesn't give up. She still doesn't know if her kid is dead or if her kid is just, in a horrible, horrible situation. She keeps looking, and finally someone finds a picture of her, something on social media, outside of a convenience store in Dallas. And the Texas authorities are able to recognize where that convenience store is, and they're able to find the guy. So, and that's another current active trial. But they're able to find they're able to find the guy, and Texas marshals swoop in, pick her up. And this time, you know, Michelle's on a plane immediately. This time they give her right back to Michelle.
For the first time since that runaway.
Oh, absolutely. No question.
This is the first time that Michelle and Sage have been together. Okay.
Yes, in 5 months. And so, when they later get on a plane, that's when Sage starts just opening up and just sharing, you know, with her mom for the first time in 5 months. That's when some of this information starts to come out, because she's feeling so guilty about having lied about, you know, their abuse and that sort of thing. And that's when some of this information starts coming out about what she was told by the defender.
And so they go home. Does Maryland try to get Sage back?
So Maryland, they've already granted the order for her to go. So they do not, because on November, you know, right before Sage ran away, the judge, on the condition that she go to this facility, had granted her release and had agreed that there was no grounds to keep her in Maryland. So they really can't do anything more to get her back to Maryland at that point. And in fact, that was why they wouldn't ping her phone, because they were very clear, Maryland, you know, the Department of Juvenile Services or something, it said we have no legal claim to hold on to this child.
Okay. So they washed their hands of her.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And then the state of Virginia, does the state of Virginia make any moves to take to take Sage away from Michelle, or what is the deal?
No, so there's an ongoing, I believe, I think it's called Chin's order. When she ran away, when she left the home, in order to set in motion some of these things, there was a court order in Virginia that lets them step in and try to find and help and all. So basically, I'm not sure if it's primarily under the Virginia authority, but there's still an ongoing, the courts decide that they should go ahead and have Sage go into this treatment facility that had already been ordered and that had been set up for her. So she enters this facility, but of course by now she knows that her mom very much wants her, and her mom is allowed weekly visits, but it's sort of you know, I won't go into that it's a whole separate story. It was a kind of a scary place. It's definitely a place where kids seemingly were restrained and then disciplined in front of other kids. And, where there's a lot heavily drugged up to sort of keep them under control. But at that point, so she enters that facility in spring of 2022, it would have been, so spring of last year. And they also, remember, this was a place that would affirm her male identity. So they have sort of a progressive psychiatrist there, therapist, who is viewed as a hero to the, local pride community. And she starts, pressuring Sage and Michelle to have gender affirming care, potentially a mastectomy. And so Sage, again, take into account this is a young girl who's been through stuff that most people often don't even survive. So she's under treatment here. She's scared of different ones. She finds people pretty creepy there, the people that are treating her. She's not somebody to speak up for herself to begin with. And so she's being pressured by this therapist. And then when Michelle is they have family action planning team, I think is the name for it. They have check-in times. Michelle's being pressured to go along with this idea to consent to gender-affirming therapy. But meanwhile, during her visit to Sage, she gets a weekly visit. She has to drive back and forth 3 or 4 hours for the visit. Sage tells her, Nana, would you buy me some girls' clothes? I don't want to be a boy anymore. I want to be a girl, but please keep it secret. But she asked her to promise to keep it secret from the doctors because she was intimidated by the doctors. So this idea that you're affirming a child's desired identity, when in fact, in this case, it's not even her desired identity. She continues.
How long is she in this facility?
It ends up being a couple months. I think there's sort of they wanted to hold on to her. And again, they're getting a lot of money from the state to have this. So we go back to the idea of financial incentive. But So they have her in this facility, and Michelle is worried about the way Sage looks when she goes and gets her. She's just kind of, dead in the eyes a little bit and drugged up and all, but so she gets worried enough as once she hears this, that they're trying to pressure Sage to have a mastectomy. At least that's the way she would characterize it. That's when she started frantically looking for a lawyer again, and that's when she enlisted Josh Hetzler from Richmond, Founding Freedom's Law Center, and he said, he wasn't necessarily a family court lawyer in that particular instance, but he's like, we've just got to help you get your daughter back, and so. So finally, they have a meeting. It's by Zoom for treatment, and they're all. They
finally have a meeting by Zoom.
North Spring. There's a meeting called North Spring Facility is the name of the treatment center, and they go around. I guess it's a sort of thing where they've got therapists and doctors and administrators, and when Josh, so Michelle is typically on this Zoom call. And it's with a psychiatrist that's been pressuring her and others. And she said that when it got around to Michelle, and then Josh introduced himself as, and I'm the attorney for Michelle, and I can't remember what was Sage. She said you could have heard a pin drop. It was kind of like everything, everything stopped.
Yeah.
But what, thankfully, even though Michelle didn't know it, apparently, Sage was off to the side listening to this account. And so when they said, we want her to be released from the program, I don't know exactly what the content was, but when they indicated that they wanted her to be released from the program, that she didn't want to be a girl, I'm giving you a general sense. I don't have an exact readout of the conversation.
Could you explain it as clearly as possible, just straightforward?
Sure. When they basically indicated they wanted Sage to be released from the program, and
So there is a Zoom meeting
of the team in charge of Sage's care at the treatment facility at North Spring, and this is a fairly consistent thing, a check-in time, where the team caring for the family or for the child meets with the family to give updates or to request permission for treatment or that sort of thing. So this particular meeting, Michelle brings the attorney, Josh, into the meeting because he is prepared to say why they need to release her. They're going to ask them to release Sage back to Michelle and Roger. So they do this. They ask for the North Spring facility to release. They ask this planning team to release Sage back to Michelle for custody. And they don't want to do that. They come up with the doctor, the psychiatrist thinks that's against Sage's best interest, and they do not want to release her. They want to keep treating her because they are convinced that their treatment is critical to Sage's mental health. But they're not. What Michelle and Josh did not know in that meeting was the psychiatrist had Sage listening to the Zoom off to the side. And so the psychiatrist turned to Sage and said, do you want to go home? Do you want to leave treatment? And Sage had the courage to say yes. And so from that point on, they still kept the facility, North Spring, still pressured Michelle to keep Sage there. But because an attorney was involved and they really didn't have grounds to hold on to her legally, they released her so-called against medical advice.
Okay.
And so it took about 30 days, but they had to release her. So at that point, it was, I think, July of last year. So it had been about 11 months since Sage was actually living at home, and they released her to go back home. So that's the first time, so that she was finally home.
Okay.
So that's kind of the end of that part of the story. And Sage then, for the last several months, has been home. She's seeing a good therapy team. She's, it's going to be an endless process. She's definitely under treatment for the trauma. She's the first trial of the first of many upcoming trials, was in November, and that caused a lot of, it was pretty rough leading up to that trial because her mom gave a witness statement on her behalf. I think she wanted to go up, and if she had to testify in person, or she had a bit, she was, I think, Michelle says she was shaking. She's never seen someone physically shake so hard. She was shaking so hard she just couldn't do it. But they had the written statement, so it was okay.
Okay, so at this point, then all of these trials around her involve her. She has to give statements and be a witness to all of the abuse
in some form. Yes,
basically relive the entire thing.
And that's one of the things that's very, very hard. And it's going to be an ongoing process because it feels so impossible to her, and she still has nightly nightmares, panic attacks, setbacks. There's definitely progress, but it's a long road ahead. And every time one of these trials comes up, it's a reliving of things that a lot of adults never survive, and she's kid still. So
yeah. Is she in school again?
She tried, and she kind of got catfished by some kids who just wanted or not catfish is the wrong word. I think there were some kids who tried to just get her to tell her all kinds of, kids were just cruel. It was a bad thing. And so she now has permission from the state to do one-on-one from in-home tutoring. And that's a much better scenario. She can't be back around. She can't be around.
And she's desisted in this male identity?
Yes, she absolutely has. In fact, she told her mom, well, that was beginning back at North Spring, as I mentioned, in a weekly visit. She said, I don't want to be a boy anymore. I want to wear girl clothes. I want to be a girl. She told her just a couple of weeks ago, she said, Nana, I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know who I was. I just wanted to make friends. I was never a boy. I just wanted friends. And she hasn't had any indication. There's a lot of other things she's having to deal with, PTSD, anxiety, depression, but there hasn't been any reemergence of gender dysphoria at all.
And how did you find out about this story, about Sage's story?
Yeah. So I actually found out about this story on the website Parents with Inconvenient Truth About Trans.
Yeah.
And it was a story that was circulated by Billboard Chris, who's a dad who travels around trying to have conversations with people all around North America and Canada about this. So I found out about it online. But what interested me right away, I've been part of trying to fight for the new Youngkin guidelines in our public schools on requiring parental notification if a kid is going through gender transition. And I've written some articles on that. And so I was following pretty close. I follow quite a few people, detransitioners and people that write about gender. I follow quite a few of those people on social media. And so it was during that period back this fall that I saw this story about Michelle and Sage. And I thought, my goodness, that's in Virginia. That ties directly to the policy that Governor Youngkin is trying to ensure is followed, that parents are not kept out of the loop. And so I contacted Chris and I said, could you put me in touch with, do you know if this mom is willing to talk? Could I talk to her? And he said, well, let me put you in touch with Parents of Inconvenient Truth About Trans. And they're the ones that had tracked the story. I'd actually seen it circulating even earlier this summer, but I don't know if it hadn't mentioned Virginia or I just hadn't picked up on the connection. But some others, shout out to Red X Genevieve Black. She does fantastic investigative reporting on these issues. And she'd done a story on it too. So they said, yes, she'd be willing to talk to you. And I just said, I'm involved and I track these issues. I've written some about them and I'm also involved in policy, at some level. And so I contacted Michelle and just, very gingerly said, would you, are you open to talking about your story with me? And so she said, absolutely. That was back when, like I said, it was circulating on parent websites, but not very public. And so over a period of time, she sent me a lot of information. I talked to the Family Foundation where Josh Hetzler, the attorney that had helped her, worked, and I talked to Erin Friday. I think you've had her on your show too. So she was one of the very early ones who tried to help locate legal help and for Sage. So I, picked her brain too. And so basically, long story short, for the last few months, I have been working on documenting her story, documenting the timeline, lots of things, some things that hadn't come out yet. Michelle requested the school records so that, there could be a sense of what had actually gone on from the school's perspective. And so it became very clear to me that this was, as I checked out each part of this story, two things. One, that I felt that the story, it was really important for the story to have a broader national platform, because I felt like this was a story that could help people understand what the impact of these policies are on real life. A lot of times people hear the noise about the policy and they don't understand this is how it actually impacts real kids and real families. There's all this hype about, 40% of kids commit trans suicide if you don't affirm them. Well, that's an absurd statement. And, it's a very flawed, doesn't even reflect what the study, they get that statistic from says. But so Michelle, so I felt that, pretty early on, I thought, what, it also needs legislative remedy. And so early on, as I began to talk to Michelle and it was always a case of, I will not write anything that you have not personally gone over and that you're comfortable as in, in your voice and in your, that she's comfortable that the facts match, what happened. In terms of I will not write anything, but that, it needed to be something where, the story needed to be really checked out, and that aligned with what she had lived. And also that she was comfortable with moving ahead with this idea of a legislative solution. And that Sage was, more to the point, because I also realized if you tie a name and a story to a law, it helps, again, understand why that law is necessary. And multiple conversations over the months, because I really wanted to be sure this wasn't something where Sage, who had been used and exploited for almost a year, that she would ever feel like, I was used, my name was used in ways that I wasn't comfortable with. So there were multiple conversations. From the very beginning, it was a yes, this would actually mean something. It would mean that her suffering mattered. It would mean that there was hope for others if her story could help others. You can't take back or redeem what happened to her. What happened to her is a horror of a nightmare that you can't, quote unquote, make better. But I think there's a sense that if my story can help others, if my courage in sharing my story with others and lending my name to a law that explains why it's necessary, if that can help others, then there's a sense, like I said, maybe redemptive is the wrong word, but there's a little bit of a sense of that there's a redemptive sense to that legislation, that it will show that, after all the gaslighting by all the institutions she was up against, about all their efforts to crush her, that it mattered enough that people got together and read my story and their hearts were touched, and they got together to get their legislators to pass something so this can never happen again in this particular, because of these particular deficiencies, to another child. So there's a very strong sense there for, for her and her family, that if this can help others, it's worth going through, for Michelle to tell the story, to have the courage to get up there and share the awful, some of the awful details of what happened.
And what's the legislation?
That's the legislation. So then then we thought, okay, how do we...
What is the legislation?
The legislation is Sage's Law. It's called Sage's Law, and it's a House Bill 2432 in the Virginia Assembly House of Delegates. And the sponsor is Dave LaRock. And of course, all these pieces had to come together in a pretty short period of time. But our goal was to present the story on a national platform with a press conference and introduce the bill all at the same time, so that we could really explain in a pretty strong way up front what happened and why we were introducing this bill to try and remedy parts of it. So the bill is actually very simple. There's all kinds of things that went wrong with her story and all kinds of pieces we could have tried to tackle, but we felt that it was best to really go after this dual track that's impacting families all over the country and that Sage was caught up in, which is, number one, the schools hiding things from parents, policies that allow schools to secretly transition kids. Secondly, counselors that are working with kids secretly, or school staff that are working with kids secretly to push them down this track, and whether the parents know it or not. And third, this idea of misgendering as abuse. That under Virginia law, and hopefully eventually under all state laws, you cannot construe misgendering to be abuse. So if there had not been a judge and a defender who were trying to build an entire case of abuse built on misgendering, Sage could have been released and gone back to Virginia. That whole second horrifying episode of sex trafficking, I would argue, would not have happened if there hadn't been this ability to think you could build a legal case on misgendering as abuse.
Okay.
So it's just those simple points, those three. It's really just parental notification and abuse. It is not abuse to raise your biological girl as a girl or your boy as a boy. That's kind of insane that we have to get to legislation that actually says that you can raise your girl as a girl and a boy as a boy, but there it is. So...
And what was the second part about counselors? How is that phrased? How can you legislate behavior?
Yes. So that was that counselors, the language of the bill has actually changed just in the last couple of days, but it does the same thing. I actually think it's changed for the better as it went through committee process. We originally, the counseling portion of the original bill was phrased in such a way that it said something like, that it said that you cannot, school counseling personnel, so it doesn't have to just be counselors, but anyone at school cannot withhold information from parents or encourage a minor to withhold information from parents about gender transition or concerns they have about their gender.
Okay.
So kind of this idea of the ongoing, one would be
and communication with the parents.
That's right. That's right.
So but the underlying value should be that the children are not wards of the state.
That's right.
The state does not own children. That is the law that needs to, or the basis of the entire thing that needs to be explicitly rammed through all schools.
Right.
And all the unions.
Well, that is the law. That is the law, but they're getting around it with these spurious abuse charges. I mean, Virginia law is strong on parental rights.
Okay.
But they're getting around, and other states are doing this too. They get around it with these spurious abuse charges. And this is where you have to go hard at this idea of
it enables actual physical sexual abuse.
That's right.
In the case of Sage.
Absolutely. And where the concept that, using the wrong pronoun is somehow abuse, and that justifies secrecy that leads to you being led into sexual slavery. I mean, this is absurd.
Yeah.
This sort of equation of pronouns with, abuse.
Reality or something.
Right. Yeah.
And so what state is this law? It's being heard and then might be voted on and then codified?
Right. So the interesting thing I'll pull back for just a second on the political context in Virginia, because the interesting thing about where we are right now in Virginia is that the previous governor had pushed through those terrible school policies, the exact ones that led Sage to being, led to Sage's situation. So the new governor, Governor Youngkin, revoked those policies And his new model policies, actually like our bill, don't say whether or not you can choose to have your child receive so-called gender-affirming care. It just says parents have to be involved. And parents are the ones that are, and that's what our bill does. That's the bottom line is the state is not the one best placed to determine the best interest of the child. And so the parents need to know and they need to be in charge. That's really just the bottom line. But so the new model policies that Youngkin put in generated enormous controversy in Virginia among the Pride and LGBTQ groups and human rights campaign. And with this claim that kids are going to be made homeless and kids are going to, and there were actual sites set up to help kids run away and to help kids run away to Fairfax to be rehomed in affirming
so it's a sanctuary city for discontented youth.
That's right. It's actually, it's profoundly
the grooming
illegal.
Capital of Virginia.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's profoundly illegal. And they kind of got caught in it and had to distance themselves from this project. But there's, there's screen captures of these offers to rehome kids. I mean, what could go wrong there, right? And so there was all this controversy. But the really interesting thing is right before elections this past year, a delegate in Virginia named Elizabeth Guzman had this glowing interview where she promised to introduce a bill that would make misgendering abuse. And so, and could then allow Child Protective Services to come in and question the parents and all. And she was all happy about this. She was interviewed by a local reporter, Nick Minock, and it exploded because she thought she was making a great counter to the Youngkin policies, but Democrats ran for the hills because people were furious and they knew their voters were not in line at all with that. No, they're like, "Are you kidding me? Taking kids away from their parents because you're misgendering them?" And so she realized she had badly overstepped. California might be a different situation, but in Virginia, the vast majority of regular voters are like, "Are you insane? Like, that's not, we don't take kids away because, parents don't instantly decide that they're not going to use your birth name and pronouns, not use your birth name and pronouns." So what was so interesting about that was a lot of these Democrats who distanced themselves officially from their position actually do believe it can be abused to misgender, but officially they distance themselves. And what that says is they don't think their voters are there yet.
Yeah, yet.
And so that's the intriguing part. And so what is very interesting about the context now is in the Senate, the Democrats control the Senate, especially the committee that this bill would have to go through. There's this woman, it's the chair of it, I think is still Janet Howell, and she's like, that committee is the graveyard of all bills on parental transparency. I mean, she is notoriously determined to keep parents out of the process.
Great.
In fact, so she is really the backstop of every Fairfax school board member.
Yeah, the devouring mother.
Yeah,
figure.
I mean, it's appalling the stuff that she will, that she'll try to keep from happening. But so our chance to get this in the public attention and to have people understand how significant this is through the House. And right now, the chief patron is a Republican. I'm hoping that we'll pick up Democrats because I know that we have the most progressive, the kookiest Democrats, for lack of a better word, are on the Education Committee. So Guzman, the delegate who proposed this bill that would make it misgendering, sits on the Education Committee. But by having a press conference right up front, by telling the story, that set the stage so that this bill could not be ignored. And the Republicans were in favor immediately. I mean, this lines up very much with where just about everybody is on this issue. So it went through the subcommittee, and we asked felt like it was important for the bill to actually have a hearing. And Virginia, this has been a learning experience for me. My previous experience is at a federal level, writing legislation at a federal level, and it's a much more formal process and all. At the state level, it's often pretty informal. It's pretty much, Joe Schmo can come up and speak at the mic if they want to oppose or support. It's actually kind of nice. It's like very much of a citizens' legislature. So we asked for there to be a special exception to the way hearings are normally held. Not really an exception, but the exception to the order, because we felt like it was really important to have expert witnesses be able to weigh in, something you would do at a federal level, but that typically doesn't really happen at the state level. So this past Monday of this week, the subcommittee on K through 12 education held a hearing. And interestingly, Bob Avoli, the chairman of that committee, obviously is a Republican since Republicans hold the House right now. The committee, he sits on the board of an anti-trafficking organization called Magnolia in his district. So he immediately, after the press conference, we went and sat down with him, and he was immediately supportive. He's also a former, I think, high school principal, so he totally got the concept of how, crazy things have become, and really wanted to help. So this hearing had Michelle give her story in a condensed version from what she did at the press conference. So she shared her story for a few minutes. And right after that, we had by Zoom these wonderful people that had gotten up at, death hour over on the West Coast to be able to participate. We had 5 witnesses. We had Erin Friday, who is the parent whom you had on your show. And so she leads a parent group all over the country, and she was one of the very first to help Sage. So she helped lay out the groundwork for why this ties to predators and sex trafficking and how widespread it is. Secondly, we had Dr. Julia Mason, who is this phenomenal pediatrician who cares for children with gender dysphoria, but has been leading the effort to get systematic evidence reviews in the American Academy of Pediatrics. And she was able to speak to the medical concerns that people may have about suicide, how we have no evidence. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary, that affirming actually helps children with gender dysphoria, and also speak to the fact that social affirmation is an intervention. It's not neutral, and schools should not be undertaking it without parents. Then we had Erin Brewer, who's also this wonderful advocate who leads an organization supporting families with gender dysphoria, and who herself was helped through gender dysphoria as a child because the school cooperated with her parents and recognized this was something she needed help with. And instead of just jumping in and affirming her, realized that her dysphoria was a result of a sexual assault and not of actual dysphoria. So she was great. She was able to speak to kids, why kids do this as well. Then we had Abel Garcia, who's this wonderful young man who transitioned and then has detransitioned and been speaking out, and he could speak to how he wished adults had protected him more and not just affirmed him, that this was something that should have been handled differently. And then finally, we tied it up with an attorney who represents cases of families like Sage's and Michelle's all over the country, but specifically in Virginia, who could speak to the legal aspects of it and how a law like Sage's law will help protect families that are battling this encroachment by the state into wedging themselves between parent and children on this one issue. I mean, you're basically pushing child emancipation in one specific area, and saying that we are going to decide unilaterally that a child is emancipated by age, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 on this issue alone. We are going to proclaim this child medically emancipated and emancipated in other ways. Well, that is flatly against the law, but obviously with efforts like Guzman's, we need to have a law that allows parents to retain charge of their children and to pursue what's in their best interest. I mean, you cannot possibly make the case in Sage's story that anyone in that story outside of her mother actually had her best interests at heart, and they actually ended up harming her under the guise of protecting her.
Yeah.
So that was Monday. The vote passed on party lines. There was a lot of hyperbole and anger from witnesses saying this is going to kill trans people, this is going to kill trans kids. after hearing all this testimony about the actual evidence, and then there's a lot of, but the bill passed on party lines 5-3, and then it went over to full committee. It was originally supposed to be heard on Wednesday, but that got put off because there was some effort to we weren't sure where some people were on some of the bill. There was an effort to reworked some of the language, I think, in actually better ways.
Yeah.
And the vote happened. So then a fairly short vote occurred yesterday morning, and it passed again on party lines, but it did pass. So it will be heard by the full House this coming Monday or Tuesday. And then the crossover day is on Wednesday, and it heads over to the Senate, and that's when it heads over to this committee. So,
okay. And so the Senate can veto that or not pass it on. The Senate can kill it. So
the Senate, the Democrats are very confident that the Senate's going to kill it. I'm not so confident. I'm not going to say that happens until it does.
But they can.
Because they can.
Procedurally. Okay.
Procedurally. Yeah. The interesting thing is seemingly, unlike at a federal level, typically the Senate actually has to take up a bill that the House votes on. So assuming it goes through the House, what's going to happen is when there's a dynamic of, it's one thing to say that you think kids should not, that misgendering is abuse just generally. It's a whole other to get down on the floor and cast your vote for your whole district in favor of or against. This is an up or down vote. So this is the Guzman bill, but in reverse. And our stance is, good. If you distanced yourself from the bill that said misgendering is abuse, that's great. That's where we are too. So you should have no problem voting for a bill that actually protects kids from ever being taken away from their parents because of spurious charges of abuse based on misgendering.
Yeah.
So it will be very interesting. Sometime, that's why these things get fought so hard in committee, because the committee Democrats have nothing to lose. They're the kooky progressive ones whose districts are already like so solid blue that, they could vote to take Sage away tomorrow from her parents, and maybe it wouldn't matter. But that's not most of Virginia. Most of Virginia is solidly in the camp of parents are the ones who need to stay in charge of their children. And there was a recent poll in Virginia showing that the vast majority of parents also think that parents should be kept in the loop with their if their child transitions at school. And that's Democrats and Republicans. This is not a partisan issue. They're making it a partisan issue, but it is not a partisan issue. It's about parenting. I mean, Erin Friday testified, and she led with the fact that I've been a lifelong Democrat, and I absolutely support this bill. Our parents are of all backgrounds, all political backgrounds, all political beliefs. I mean, the people helping Sage are lifelong Democrats, lifelong Republicans, independents, and libertarians. I mean, they were like a total mix, just even in that small team of people helping. So, you've really got, this is something that cuts across all. So what will be fascinating to watch is what they actually choose to do, because right after this legislative session ends, primary season begins, and every single seat of every single delegate and senator this session is up for re-election, is up for grabs. And
so if they can kill it in committee and not bring it to a vote, then they would be safe from being exposed to that vulnerability. But because in Virginia, if the House approves something, then it has to go to vote in the Senate.
So I guess what I meant was, what the Senate, I'm sure, was hoping was that the House committee would kill the bill.
Okay.
Because there would be little cost to those House Democrats.
Okay.
Because their districts are probably pretty safe.
All right,
but once it gets to the House floor, you're talking about something much more public. Yeah. And whether those delegates are going to be willing to cast their votes for something like that is a whole other question. And I have a feeling we may get some Democrats. I mean, we're going to see. I'm going to be down in Richmond talking to people on Monday. And then once it goes over to the Senate, unlike at a federal level, the Senate actually has to take up a bill. So
it's just the entire thing is wrong, just in principle. the entire that this is even a question.
Right.
It exposes the government as something that needs to be limited. Absolutely, and it's not set up to limit itself. It's set up to swallow as much as possible, and that we're even at this point says something about the entire structure of our political apparatus and its assumptions.
So we'll see. I mean, this story has gone. This is what we hoped. It rested on the success of this law. Rested on this story capturing people's understanding and hearts. And I'm telling you, Virginians are like, stuff is pouring in from all over Virginia, I'm talking to administrative staff when I go try to meet with legislators. And like, oh, this is for Sage. There's people all over Virginia praying for her. This is like, and our local radio, in the DC, Northern Virginia area, WMAL has carried this story for 4 days straight. And including on the TV show, I was on their TV show, and then the host was sitting in for Mark Levin, which has like 12 million weekly listeners, and he went into it at length on that. Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, a bunch of others have covered the story. I mean, they're even, the New York Post has mentioned it. There's stories. So it's, what we wanted was for it not to be able to be ignored. And interestingly enough, making my point, every time you see an appeal from the ACLU or Human Rights Campaign, it does not mention Sage's law. It calls it by HB 2432, because that way people can delink the story from the policy that caused it.
Yeah. Yeah, the ACLU. What a joke organization.
And Equality Virginia. I know. I mean, my goodness. Well, I mean, if it's led by an attorney who's trans, what are you going to expect? This isn't an objective organization at all.
No, not at all. So what's next for you then?
I was just saying, you made this point earlier, but what's interesting to me is the responses. This idea that adults who are wholly unconnected to a minor child somehow can speak for that child because they themselves are a transgender adult. Well,
they're speaking to an identity and for an identity. It's a completely different worldview, which I've gone into in depth. It's just their entire worldview causes them to act this way and think this way. It's that there's no real individual. There's just basically an identity, and they are a representative of an identity, and they project that identity onto, like, even the notion of a transgender child is unquestioned. And if you take that as legitimate concept, then it becomes a part of this totalitarian apparatus and this way of thinking. So. There's so many different assumptions that causes them to, that most people don't see. They just see this behavior, find it questionable, and then are put into this moral quandary about caring or not caring, or being a bigot, not being a bigot, when underneath all of those gaslighting techniques is this totalitarian move towards a one world kind of identity soup.
Right. And what's very interesting are the cracks in the monolith right now. And one of the things that I discovered a little bit late in the game, but that's going to play a prominent part from now on, is the fact that do you know who Dr. Erica Anderson is? So Dr. Erica Anderson is, he is a biological male who transitioned as an adult and provides gender affirming care to transgender kids, adolescents, adults out in, I believe adults too, but out in Berkeley, somewhere in California. But so Dr. Anderson has sat on the board of the standard setting organization, so WPATH, and actually has been the head of the U.S. branch of that. But she is actually concerned that this whole push in schools and the rush to affirmation has gone too far. So this is from someone who actually does these interventions, but believes that parents need to be involved. And Dr. Anderson has written articles both out in California and I think either for the Washington Post or New York Times, but feels so strongly about this that there's an amicus brief from Dr. Anderson in a case against Maryland District schools that specifically addresses this. And so we actually reworked some of the language in the bill a little bit. It does the same things, but to conform to some of the ways things were phrased, because it was a very helpful phrasing, we started off with the language in a different statute. We've changed all that, but it's the same language. But that basically what we are doing is conforming to what she recommends in this court brief. So it's a phenomenal amicus brief. And I'm expecting that to make it also very difficult for Democrats to say, this is against trans people, when you have somebody who is one of the leading authorities on transgender care, who has basically laid out the reasons for Sage's Law. So I will be very interested in seeing them squirm out from under that.
And what's the timeline going forward for this bill?
So the timeline going forward is very short. The bill goes to a floor vote either Monday or Tuesday, crosses over to the Senate on Wednesday, and then the process lasts a few weeks where the committee can it has to go through a committee first. So as I told you, it will go through the committee led by someone I consider to be an evil ideologue, but led by Senator Janet Howell, who stops every bill that can possibly involve parents more than she thinks it should, and she thinks parents basically shouldn't be involved. So I'm categorizing, of course, but that is, if you look at her record, that is pretty much what happened. So, and that committee, very intentionally, this is somebody who talked about the power of the state. A few years ago, someone ran against her in her district and had a pretty good shot at upsetting her. And Janet Howell sat on the redistricting committee. So she redistricted her race, her own campaign, so that she would not have to face this particular opponent with that particular set of precincts. So this same lovely legislator who's been there for decades and considers herself entitled to be there forever, also sits on the education committee. And there's something like a 3 to 4 person disparity between Republicans and Democrats. So humanly speaking, it's a very uphill climb. But quite honestly, none of this has happened so far at the humanly speaking level, because I think a lot of things have coalesced in ways that are perhaps unique to this particular time where there's a crack in the monolith at a lot of fronts on this ideological front, and to where people are beginning to wake up to how destructive and these parental secrecy policies are. So it will be, keep an eye on it, because there may be some pretty explosive discussions on the House floor. And, you know, what people are willing to vote when they have a primary, this is a perfect issue to run on, because, you know, if your opponent thinks kids should be taken away from their parents, you know, that's a pretty strong case against an opponent. So it'll be very interesting, given the timing here, what happens, even in the Senate, if it makes it out of the House. And predictions are that it will make it out of the House. I never count my chickens before they're hatched, but it's made it through subcommittee with some of the most progressive Democrats on it. It's made it through committee on the House floor. So, and the House leadership is very much in favor of it. And Governor Youngkin will, I'm sure, sign this bill because it's right in alignment with his policies. So,
wow. From the personal to the political, and then back again.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Laura, for explaining this story to me. And what's your what is it that you do? You're a writer for various outlets and stuff. Do you have your own blog?
Sometimes. I don't have my own blog. I'm really more.
You're an advocate.
And I'm a mom. I'm not affiliated with any organization. I'm not getting paid for any hours that I put in or whatever. And I will say, I've just really become good friends with Michelle, too. This is just one of those kind of, the sort of friend that you want at your back. I mean, the sort of person will do what she did for her daughter. But so I would certainly consider her a friend after all these months, too. But I'm just a mom in Fairfax who's worked at different points with others. My background, I have 5 kids. And I don't quote unquote work outside. I mean, outside the home, it's work to be a mom, but I've gotten involved in different things at different points, kind of helps. My expertise is in advocacy and policy. I was the lead congressional staff drafter of the International Religious Freedom Act back in 1998, which set up a whole apparatus at the State Department to address international religious persecution, so of all varieties. So an ambassador at large, a whole structure of annual reporting around the world, and actions that were required by our government. Those were all, I was the main staff researcher and drafter of that law, and we've seen it. And I was working at the time for a Democrat from Tennessee and had been for several years doing advocacy, international human rights advocacy. And before that, I was acting human rights officer in Romania in our embassy right after totalitarianism. So back then, I was investigating incidents of violence against minorities. They sort of laughed. They called me the gypsy queen at the embassy, which is it's Roma, but because I was the one investigating incidents of harm against ethnic minorities and racism and violence against women.
Wait, why does the United States have power in other countries to control how human beings behave? Isn't that kind of an overreach? I mean, I'm so wary of the State Department because I see what even just the individual states are doing with controlling other people, that why are we exporting our own values? I mean, even if they're good values, what gives us the right to control other people, other populations?
So that's a good question. We don't control other people, but if it's done for the right reason, this is why you have to be careful in how you set up structures. When we take a stand, when we interact with other countries, so interestingly enough, at least 20 years ago, other countries really, like Romania, really looked to the U.S. to help the human rights activists and the dissidents, stand up to their governments. And so we can't control we cannot control what other governments do. We do, however, have a right to create incentives and disincentives and negotiate with other governments through our own power, right? If you have a lot of power, you have that power. So the question is how you're going to use it. And so if you structure it correctly, you can use it for good. Obviously, you can also use it for great evil. But to have laws, in our case, I mean, just, thumbnail, we were also responding. Our bill specifically built on international human rights standards that virtually all of these countries had agreed to. So our definitions, we were very careful with our definitions to basically be tracking with both human rights language, both in the international documents and our own. And what we went after were the fact that, we might say, like in the human rights legislation that we set up back in the 70s, that was set up back in the 70s, that created the human rights reports. We might say that, there should be this consequence. We should withdraw aid, say, from a country that is,
not conforming to our moral.
Citizen. Right. So, but
what happens when our morality gets corrupted? And it is at this point.
Well, that's
if you look at what we're exporting now, it's that pride flag. It's that pride flag with the transgender flag, and that's what we're doing.
Problem. Yeah.
It's an imperialist.
Yes. And that's the downside, is that if you get bad people in power, you can't control. So this was one of the things we set up, partially because this was we had a combined, I think, 16 years of experience with the people who wrote that bill. I was in Congressman Clement's office he was from Tennessee. My husband was working for Senator Richard Lugar, who'd been chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. He'd been doing this for like 16 years. We weren't married at the time. And the other one was working for Sam Nunn and then for a Republican in Texas. So we had years of experience in seeing how do we try to influence other governments to do what's right in human rights, to change a law that is restrictive on oppressing religious freedom or to get a prisoner released. And it's remarkable, if you work carefully and on a bipartisan basis, it's remarkable what another government is willing to do if they realize that, really, why do you care about this person stuck in jail? It can be sometimes no big deal to them to release one person in return for a closer relationship with the U.S. Yeah. So that power used for good can actually really do substantial things. So our thinking when we set up an ambassador at large position, there's also provisions to negotiate that there are consequences potentially if certain levels of violations occur in that country, consequences having to do with our relationship with them. But those consequences can be waived if you negotiate a binding agreement with that government that those particular violations will cease. And we had the odd experience of So writing that legislation that passed in 98, and then when my husband, John Hanford, was actually appointed by George Bush to be the ambassador that negotiated those treaties for the next, for those two terms. And so he's the only ambassador to ever have negotiated a binding agreement. But when we were researching that law, we actually looked at trade law. What works in trade law? Because sanctions often don't work. What works? And what works is the negotiating process that leads up to that, the leverage of there might be sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I don't know if you're interested in this particular example, but like in Vietnam, for instance, way back when, back in the early 2000s, so this was specifically on religious freedom. This is when my husband was ambassador. They were, the state, local governments in Vietnam were rounding up people and forcing confessions out of them to renunciations of faith from them by the thousands. They'd shut down thousands of small churches. They had a couple dozen religious prisoners in jail. So my husband ended up negotiating an agreement with them that released all those prisoners, that where the Vietnamese also put in place regulations that they would no longer do the forced renunciations, and they started a process. They put in place a legal process to reopen hundreds and maybe thousands of churches. It had a measurable impact on people's lives. And it ended up not ending in something bad. It was good for both governments. So that's the sort of thing, if you can negotiate for, it doesn't matter why a government just like the Democrats, I don't care why, if they vote for a bill, I don't care why. I don't care if it's because, I'd like to think it's because a lot of them know this is the right thing to do. And I think that will be the case for some. But if they vote for Sage's Law because they think that their voters won't accept them opposing it, fine by me, as long as the law goes through, So
yeah.
Anyways, I think that's it's a great question. And the problem is now we have people that, that are negotiating for are negotiating with other governments for terrible things. So that's why we need to not have an administration like this one that cares about all the wrong things and pushing all the wrong things on other countries, and not the right things.
I don't know, man. It's just, I guess it's natural that the superpower would peddle influence and affect things in its favor selfishly, but also in its favor morally. But the fact of the matter is that I guess power just corrupts. So just assuming that America might makes right, basically. So as long as America does have might, it's going to.
That's why we have laws. But
yeah, but I mean, if the laws are structured with the assumptions that the state, it comes down to, are we even in a liberal democracy anymore? Or is that kind of just what we call ourselves, when in fact it's a state that wants to control as much aspects of its citizens' lives as possible.
Right.
And conform them to itself by using media, all the things that are all connected. But you're right there, like down the road from the center of ultimate power in Virginia. Or you're in Virginia, right? You guys are all connected to the deep state. So you know it better than I do. I'm kind of
I don't know better than you do. I've been there and I've seen, I've gone toe to toe with Gamal Mubarak, his, Mubarak's son. We almost shut down the Egyptian president's visit because we got enough senators and congressmen to care about this. I remember going in to meet with Hosni Mubarak about...
What year is this?
This would have been 98-ish or 6. I don't know. It was right around... It was like around then. And there had been this rash of attacks against Coptic Muslims, and they were passing the government was passing a terrible law that was shutting down a bunch of human rights NGOs. And so there was supposed to be this big presidential delegation, but because several of us working together, the congressmen and senators who cared, were speaking up about this, it almost shut down the presidential visit. And so we started getting all the staff of the members, the congressmen and senators who were speaking out, started getting all these high-level visits from, the Egyptian president's son or the delegation. And there was one interesting one where they came into, they were passing this law that would have restricted a lot of human rights activity. And it wasn't just religious, it was any human rights activity. And they came in to tell us all about this and how this law was actually not restricting it. So this high-level delegation, and it included the token Coptic businessman to show that they had religious freedom, and some others. And they started to ask me questions to make statements about the law. And I said, well, actually, that's not the case, because I had gone through their whole law. And I had this document printed out of their law with like colored tabs on practically every page. And so I flipped over to it and I was like, so here's where it's, so that just shut down the conversation entirely, because they knew that I had read their law and they knew we were getting this information out. But on one point after that meeting, it was like one of those meetings with the president's son had come in to try to persuade it. And I happened to take that meeting because the congressman was out. But I was the one who had command of the details anyways. And after the meeting concluded for like 3 hours, it went on. They tried to say this was how I went back and forth. And, you know, I was right. I mean, I had the law right there and they were just making patently false assertions about what was in it. So, the one businessman hung back, had some pretext or whatever, and he looked me in the eyes and he said, thank you. And I just thought, you know, this is why we do this. We do this because it matters in some of these other countries. It matters that they're heard, and it matters that the U.S. is actually trying to take a stand. I mean, again, this goes to using your power for, you know, for good and not evil, and that's always a risk. If you have a government structure, if you have somebody good in charge, they can use all the laws for good. If you have somebody bad, even if you have laws, you're still at the mercy of a bad actor. Well, I mean,
good or bad, or like I've been speaking with us podcaster types, we like to talk about theory a lot, and you're talking about reality. So like there's a concept of negative rights and positive rights. As long as we're advocating for negative rights, going forth and trying to restrain governments, right? That's one thing. Once it becomes like trans rights or human rights, once we start advocating for positive rights, once we start doing to other countries what we're doing to ourselves, like that, it's like, what's going on here?
Yeah, and it is, I mean, honestly, what we're advocating for, like just to take, you know, since human rights was really my background, but just since what we're advocating for when we do it right is really something that governments have already, as a community of governments, agreed to. They just don't do it. So then and they're imposing their restrictions on imposing their restrictions on their own citizens, which, you know, it's not that we have legal purview over that, but sometimes using that influence, sometimes speaking up, sometimes you're trying to keep governments from imposing their ideological framework on their own citizens.
But we're imposing our ideological framework on these governments. That's the thing. We assume that we're doing good.
There shouldn't be one. You're right. And
we are assuming that we're objective, but we come from a cultural time and place. We come from an English-derived system of common law that is particular to our people, and it doesn't. I don't know if you can transplant liberal ideology and all the behaviors and values that make that work into these other countries with other histories and stuff, right? Without corroding, maybe they worship a king, or maybe they have a monarchy that works for them. Maybe totalitarian to a certain degree works for the Chinese. Maybe that works for that type of people because it's embedded in their culture. And to assume that we know best and then trick ourselves into we are being objective, and then we get infected by these mind viruses, something like trans or gender ideology, and we just assume that we're right and that everybody else is a bigot and wrong, right? That entire chauvinistic, supremacist blindness that we have to our own uniqueness, it's problematic, to use a tired term.
I think that's a factor, but I also think pulling back when you deal with real life situations, I think I would agree. I mean, I would certainly say, and I think this is generally, I mean, when I was doing this, you know, from the U.S. government, there's zero assumption that our particular framework is the best. Like, you know, I think you can have good government in a number of different scenarios. You know, it doesn't have to look like the U.S., and religious freedom doesn't have to look like the U.S. either. Going back to my particular area of expertise, since that was really, you know, my background and the human rights work that I did. But let's say, but most people have a basic agreement, and countries around the world, most people do not say that you should put to death someone for their religious beliefs. Now, there are sects of certain countries that do. And I would argue, let me give you another example that my husband worked on during his time as ambassador. There's a rise of Hindu nationalism, very strongly Hindu nationalism in India. And this has all kinds of ramifications for people who are not Hindu, particularly Muslim communities. So during the time that my husband was in office, there was a horrific incident where Muslims were just slaughtered by extremists. It was in Gujarat province, and there were police that were notified, that were there and did not intervene for hours. I mean, people were just slaughtered. Now, most people, I'm going to say, no matter what culture you're from, most people would not look upon that as being, oh, that's just the way the Hindus manifest their particular religion. That's okay. It's just, us being chauvinistic to intervene and say that that's not okay. There's a basic bottom line agreement for most things like that you should not have the freedom to just slaughter people of other beliefs because you have political and religious hegemony in that particular province. So in that particular case, under my husband, they did use the law that we had created to ban visits from the head of that province, even though it was someone who had tremendous clout in the U.S. and in India. So that's a tiny thing. And then, of course, advocated to try to get justice and all. That's a tiny thing. It doesn't fix what happened, but it does send the signal to another government that there could be repercussions from this person that you are courting for trade and all there could be repercussions. And changing someone's cost benefit analysis is sometimes sufficient to protect the vulnerable. And that's sort of the predicate. But you're absolutely right.
But I mean, that I agree with that. But when we get to a place where our government is forcing people to make cakes for people that they don't want to make cakes,
I know.
And then what do you think we're going to do to other people? I mean, it goes. Once we start to behave that way here.
Absolutely. No, we're in an entirely different situation. Even when I was doing human rights work 25 years ago, I used to say as a human rights officer, when I went in to meet with people, the U.S. has an individually based approach to human rights. And we recognize that a lot of other countries have a community-based approach to human rights.
Yeah.
What we have shifted to in this whole dialogue in the U.S. is this identity community-based concept. And it is disastrous because it exacerbates, it's the balkanization of these issues. How did that work out for, Bosnia and Herzegovina and even just like recently? And when I was overseas in Romania, I saw it. It was recently. I mean, it had been just a few years since Ceausescu fell. And even that was murky, the dictator back at the time. This was probably before you were tracking things like this. But I was in college studying Eastern Europe. I grew up overseas in France and went through the French system most of my life, and then came to college in the U.S. and was in school when the wall fell, the Berlin Wall fell, and when that whole series of revolutions happened in Eastern Europe. And I was fascinated by it. And I ended up going over to study in Romania the summer after the government fell. And then going back over, I did my thesis work on Romania and some of the activists there. What was fascinating to me by the time I went back as working for the embassy in 93, 94 was how clearly people perceived themselves not at all so much as, let's say, Romanian citizens, but as particular ethnicities or members of a certain community. So they were Hungarian or ethnic Romanian or Roma first, and then very much, then very much Romanian or state citizen actors. Now, our whole society in the U.S. was predicated on this idea that you are U.S. citizen first, and then you're all these other wonderful things that you bring to the table, whether you're from Mexico or Iceland or Germany or France. So this idea that we're doing this experiment where the citizenship matters first and then the other connection. I don't think we're there anymore. I think the left has profoundly pushed, I mean, not as much. I think this idea of you are who you are in a particular identity, and if it's a victimized identity that gives you even more power, it's a real shift from it is a balkanization. And I think it was dangerous back in Romania because would tolerate things that they would feel like it was justified because, it was just against the Roma, so they're delinquents anyways, it didn't matter. Even among educated people. So
I mean, one of the things that I'm wrestling with in my dialogues with the so-called like neo-reactionary or kind of dissident right, just kind of thinkers and podcasters, is that the basic assumptions that American citizenry isn't a culture, it's not an ethnicity, it's just an idea, it's just a set of values. If that ever really did exist, or if it was an aspiration that lined up with a certain ethnicity, which would be kind of a Puritan, kind of European kind of assumption of certain types of behavior, certain values, that then we can assume this kind of this very loose, liberal, non-particular, or this acceptance of difference with a unifying principle. The question that I keep on trying to wrestle with is that, did that U.S. identity, was it ever strong enough to marry all these ethnicities, or to homogenize without homogenizing ethnicities? And it's possible because we were in the New World, we were an experiment. We do take people from all these places, and it's gained a lot of. We've done a lot of very wonderful things. Maybe history just lucked out on us with our resources and how the rest of the world shook out, put us up on top. But what the left is showing is that we have always been very vulnerable to a particular moral framework, and that moral framework had been assumed and grew weak, and now is being overrun by what we colloquially call wokeness, right? And, which is emblazoned in that pride flag that even the State Department just last June, they took down the American flag and they put up the pride flag. Like that's empire now. Sure. That's the ruling bonding thing.
Well, and I think that's always a risk. If you give people freedom, they're likely to abuse it, right? So, I mean, it's just in a framework. If you start off with people that have there was a certain, I think, I mean, I'm not an expert in American history. And like I told you, I grew up in France, so I've seen it kind of operate both ways. So I have this strange smattering of lots of European history, outside, and then I was in a Canadian and then American. And so, so when I came, when I came to work in the Senate or on the Capitol Hill, I was interested in working on an issue, and I hadn't figured out where I stood politically. I was a registered independent, and I was working for a Democrat. So, I'm still, quite honestly, more issues driven than party driven. But I think today there is no room in the Democratic Party for people like me, who might be very open on some issue. Like I am definitely not an isolationist, because I've lived overseas and I've seen the impact that one country can have on another, for good or evil. I am not and never will be an isolationist. I also think that we have an appalling policy on refugees, and that has been the case both under Democratic and Republican administrations. We're greedy. We should be welcoming people far more. But I'm very strong on not wanting, on the fact that other issues that you have to. So I'm a mix, but and on this wokeness issue, I'm very much. It's a religion. I mean, it is absolutely a religion. And in the case of and with the transgender ideology, I mean, we're talking practically about a cult. I mean, we're talking about, those are strong words, but,
there's strong actions that they're taking. Yes. So
the pain is real. The pain of these kids is real. And that is just what burns me up, because, and what has kept me staying involved in this particular fight, because these kids are hurting. They are disassociated from other kids. They're the kids that are the most alienated, the most vulnerable, the kids that get pulled into this. And they are sold the idea that they will somehow be happier if they get the outside to match the whatever combination of stuff they're feeling on the inside. And that is a terrible way to tell a kid to solve a problem. It's a lie. It's not going to happen. And then but then you also hand these vulnerable kids a cause and an enemy, because the real problem isn't anything going on inside of me and anything that I have to tend to, some pain I have to deal with from past trauma, from assault, from something that's going on inside of me. The real problem are these evil people on the outside, including now my parents, who refuse to affirm me. Yeah. So, it's just, I'm going to say it's just evil. It is, yeah. You want to support these kids. You want to recognize, and I think a lot of people are just so deluded or are so caught up in the ideology that they think they're trying to help. People go into social work to be a judge, to be a teacher, to be a counselor because they want to help people, but they get captured by this ideology. Yeah. And then to bring it back to Sage's story, the cruelty is just unbelievable of what actually happens when they implement these policies, and they're blind to it.
Yeah. It's a very present danger. And the fight is real, and the consequences are very, very, very real to our children, to the next generation, because a lot of these kids aren't going to be able to have kids if they go through the medical thing. And then you apply that to the American government writ large and its influence on a global scale, and it's just like holy moly.
Well, I will tell you. One thing that got me back into this a couple years ago was I looked at Biden's platform. The LGBTQ platform, and what I realized was it was carefully written to almost mirror the legislation that I had written with my husband on international religious freedom. They were going after other countries in very much the same way. It was like they had lifted, and granted, our legislation did serve. It was the most significant human rights legislation that we'd had for decades. So it then served as a model for the sex trafficking office, and it served as a model for several other things. So because we had this careful structure and an ambassador and, an annual report, and just the fact of reporting on something means embassies all over the world are having to go out and talk to people, and that is protective in and of itself. All those things. But what I saw was basically that whole framework was lifted and applied to pushing LGBTQ issues all over the country. Yeah. So imagine what happens. So if we become in the business of going after governments that are traditional, that where there's a traditional society, and we're trying to push on them something like this, that's absurd.
Well, we're doing it to ourselves too.
What we're doing to ourselves. And it's also throughout the U.S. government. There's this enormous focus on enforcement and on getting rid inside government of people that are not going to comply with all this. So, it's kind of a horrifying aspect, and it's very deliberate, and a lot of it depends on secrecy. So that's secrecy.
Well, it's odd because there's secrecy, I'm sure, because they don't want to reveal the extent to it, but Biden's very explicit about his demonization of anybody of the other team. He calls for unity in one speech, and then he does this weird Hitler thing where all the MAGA fascists, we're going to get rid of them, but they are the most fascistic. They're fascistically unifying in this homogenous LGBT rainbow Hitler kind of thing, the rainbow Nazi kind of like uniformity through the whole thing. And then they project that, and then we're all afraid to even speak, because then they pressure school boards, to call parents who are complaining about this like domestic extremists. Then they're deplatforming us. They're pressuring Twitter to deplatform dissent. It's phenomenally powerful.
It is. I know. And I don't know, I don't know how or why it has so thoroughly captured one party.
It was pretty quick too. Yeah.
It was quick. In 2015, I don't know that I even knew what a school board was, and had never paid attention. I had no idea that there was a movement to transition kids. That's just what is that, like 8 years ago? And it is like this cascade of terrible, terrible policies and very powerful, influential people. I mean, granted, there's a ton of money behind it too.
Yeah.
So,
well, and if you look at it historically, it's kind of a long march through the institutions. So they captured the universities first, and from the universities, they went to the New York Times, they went into government, and then they went into all the professional organizations. So you can trace it back to the university ideas. And if you want to go, James Lindsay with it, you can see that there's like these ideas of it's just Marxism, just infecting our government through a long march. And we just watched over the last decade, we watched it kind of bloom. We didn't know that it was there, now then it just went
like exponentially. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, but you're involved in the fight. That's really fascinating. I'd like to talk to your husband sometime if he's up for an interview, because I am interested in actually understanding the state and the State Department a lot more, because we talk about in the abstract in my wheelhouse. We talk in the abstract about American power and liberalism and stuff like that, but like the actual sausage making, we don't. I don't see a lot of like people really understanding and like what you just opened up to me over the last hour is just such a big missing piece of the puzzle. Like,
sure. No, I mean, there's, it's the sausage making part, and it's interesting because even in the legislation, that, I mean, Sage's Law is sort of a smaller version of what we went through and much shortened, but back in, when we were writing our legislation, it was essentially a year and a half or so process, but similar aspects, similar dynamics,
politicking and
I
lobbying,
think that,
I guess.
I'm sorry?
Lobbying. You were doing a lot of lobbying and taking a lot.
Well, I was working for a member of Congress, so I was on the inside. So we're writing the legislation, but then of course working to convince others and working with outside groups who wanted various things. And but I think it's a very cumbersome process, and you see it's disheartening at some level, but you also realize. And it's disheartening to see how many interests have sway that shouldn't have sway and all those things you hear about. Yeah. But then you pull back and think, what's the alternative? I mean, it's much smoother in a totalitarian government. You don't have anybody trying to, sway you for other things, really. So it's much smoother and more efficient, but there isn't another system that's better. So for all that it's cumbersome, and I mean, generally speaking, I would say that a democracy is hugely flawed in some of the ways that it gets worked out and how influence happens.
But isn't it just an oligarchy? I mean, I don't think it's a true democracy. It's kind of like more of an oligarchy.
Well,
I mean, there's insiders.
Think about this. Think about the women in Afghanistan and Iraq who stood in lines despite threats to their lives so they could ink their thumb on a ballot, right? And what's our voting rate here in the U.S.? Does it get up to 30% on a good year? I mean, we have these rights. We take them for granted. And what happens is the people that are most adept at getting to populations, the most savvy, which right now is by far the Democrats, they are the ones who get people to the polls. Now, if everybody who actually cared about these issues were to vote, you would see something very different. So part of it is that we have become lazy. We've become lazy, and Americans, we're all busy. We don't know how to get involved in the process. There is a process to be involved. It's flawed, but it does matter. And the contrast, the contrast in other countries is there's either, or some other country, there's a semblance of a process, or it's totalitarian. Well, it's much more efficient if you have a group of people deciding from the top what laws should be and who the judges are and all that. But at least there's a process. And so for all the flaws, I would rather live in a place where it takes a year and a half to get a good bill through, but you can actually get a good bill through, and maybe it's 80% of what you want, maybe it's 70% of what you want. But you know what? That 70% is a whole lot better than where you started.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, if they're controlling, if the Democrats are controlling the education process, then they're basically if you are in a democracy, the way that you control democracy is not by trusting the people, it's by educating the people towards your will, right? And so they've already captured all those things. So they just, and then in Washington State, there's this Evergreen State College that had a huge woke explosion a few years ago. That's how I got on the scene. They basically just are a degree mill for hyper woke public figures and teachers. So they're just pumping radicals into Washington through these organizations that take the citizens' money and then feedback loop it into diversity, equity, and inclusion, all these other initiatives. So it's just really cumbersome. And I just don't know how. It's just really problematic. And getting involved is a part of the puzzle, but maybe it's just too big and it needs to be broken up. Maybe we need to go back to more state level. Just kind of kick the federal government to the curb or diminish it as much as possible and go back to more state, individual, more human-sized relationship to the body politic.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm certainly conceptually in favor of less federal government and more power to the states. That's just kind of that's always been. Originally, it was set up so that only on a few things would the federal government have power over the state. So that is something that's kind of unique to American governance. I mean, I don't think it has to be that way, but I think it's, given how things are now, yes. I mean, and, sometimes you get the really bad people, but then what gets lost too is some of the just really good people that do make it into office and the people that really are up there making a difference. And you hear the bad stories, but you don't hear, like, for instance, one of the really conservative senators from Kansas, Senator Marshall, and I forget who was on this other committee, but they may be at odds on issues like abortion, but on providing maternal rural health care to women who need it, you've got some serious bipartisanship going on. And I think part of what's happened, I mean, I thought it was partisan back when I was on the Hill, in the late 90s, early to late 90s. That was during the Clinton trial or the Clinton, stuff. And I thought it couldn't get any more polarized than that. I mean, we are so far past that now. I mean, that was the good old days, I mean, Biden was on the committee. He was chair, I think. He was minority leader on the committee that actually saw our bill through. And even back then, I mean, I won't share my opinions back then, but anyways, a lot of the people that are that are up for, but even though, however, but even I will say he and others, we're collegial with other, collegial in some major ways with other senators, and that smaller environment, there's a real, as much as I might fully disagree on some things with him on policy, there's a kindness and a human kindness that I know that he's shown to others, and that happens all the time. And it's easy to forget, like, now things are so polarized, it's almost like compromise is an evil word. The fact of the matter is we live in a democracy, and if you are not willing to compromise and try to, and see the other person's position and try to work with somebody, then everything does fall apart. Because it's not an all or nothing games. All or nothing games is what you have in dictatorships. If you play it all or nothing, it is not going to work.
Well, I mean
that's my opinion.
I don't know how we got on this, but if you look at the way that the FBI has been weaponized against the former president, Trump, with the rating of his thing, I mean, it just shows you that we are not in a democracy. There are powers that be that are not elected that run these three-letter agencies that basically the legislature reports to. Right. The way that the intelligence community has power over major players shows you that we are not actually in a democracy. And even Chuck Schumer said he let the ball drop not too long ago about how he's being watched and everybody else is being watched. And then they have their little committee over the intelligence community, but the intelligence community has everything on them. So it's just...
Yeah, I mean, I think
it just seems like democracy is like this patina upon something that's not a democracy.
Yeah, but see, I guess I'm a little different than you on that. Mostly, I mean, I agree with pretty much everything you're saying in terms of how things can get sidelined and weaponized, and that's what we're looking at. At the same time, because I've lived in countries where it's way down the path from that, and where you're talking about, Romania was one of the absolute worst, and that was a police state. And I lived there for a while, and very shortly after everything happened, and people could tell I was an American because of the way I walked and the smile on my face, and because of the way that I just assumed that if there was a problem, you could fix it.
Yeah.
Well, these people who had lived in a state where 1 out of 4 people is estimated to have participated with the spy state in Romania. It's a horrific statistic from way back then.
Wow.
And like I said, I wrote my thesis on dissidents, and particularly focus on one who spent a lot of time in jail. And so I'm pretty familiar with what went on there. And it was a place where basically you're trained, kind of like going back to Sage's story, like she was in foster care, you're trained to believe that it won't matter if you speak up. That there's this assumption that if there's a problem, okay, you learn to live with it. Like I was stuck in an elevator way back then with a couple of Romanians. And so, and my instinct was like, okay, who do we call? Where do we, and so I started asking that. And the person in the elevator with me leaned back against the wall and pulled out a cigarette. And they're like, oh, they'll fix it when they fix it. I mean, and that is like,
yeah,
it was, and that assumption that, like the fact that you did your podcast on the ultra woke, one of the really ultra wokiest places in the country, you did a podcast, you started speaking out, you have this these followers now. It doesn't look like you've been thrown in jail or prosecuted or anything like that. If you were in Romania...
I've made it onto some lists.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
But let's say if you were in Romania, if you were in Mozambique, if you were in one of these other countries, you would have put out your first podcast and we probably would never have seen you again. You know, so there is a difference. And you're an American. You have this idea that if there's a problem, man, I should at least speak up about it, and maybe I should do something about it. And that's a cultural assumption, but I think you shouldn't underestimate what that actually means in terms of, we do have a process. The process may be flawed. The process may have been hijacked. The process might need to be fixed. But I'm not willing to say that it's irredeemable. We still have structures. They may be shaky, but they're there. And that is like miles ahead of where so many other places are. That's just, I may sound like an optimist, but that's just my experience.
I appreciate your optimism because I've been looking at it through a skeptical lens for the last few years. I mean, because the more I look into it, the more I see that all of this stuff is connected to a totalitarian trend. And while I still do have freedom, you're right, I still get to write my little tracks. I don't have to flee the country like, John Locke would have to have done or, did, it says something, but unless we continue to speak up, then it's gone because it will go that way.
I agree. And Tocqueville said something very similar way back when, that if this only works for people whose values are good, basically.
It's a republic if you can keep it.
That's right. And that's always been the American experiment. And again, this is informed by the fact that I grew up overseas. In France, they had multiple bloody revolutions, and they're on their 5th constitution. We're still on our 1st. And we haven't really even had, well, we are, right? We've amended it.
In name, but like in practice, like does it, there's just some questions about,
Again, we still have a document that's essentially providing a framework. And that system of checks and balances, which recognizes that there's evil in everyone and that power can be used for good or evil, it doesn't work perfectly, but at least it's a system. It's better than, I think, the alternative. And again, that makes
I appreciate that you're being optimistic about this because, you look at these bills that they pass that nobody reads that are written by lobbyists.
Oh, it's absurd. I know.
It's appalling.
And having seen from the inside how few people actually do read it, yes, that is appalling. Yeah. That can be changed by people getting involved. There are good people up there. We just need more of them.
Okay. All right. Well, when are you going to run?
Well, not while my job is first being a mom, but I thought about it.
Yeah. How much longer do you have of motherhood? I mean, I know it's eternal, but like local
So I actually have kids in college, high school, middle school, and elementary right now.
Oh, geez, you get the whole spread. Yeah,
I do. But late elementary, so so middle school. So I don't want to be working so hard to help other people's kids that my kids don't have their mom in these few precious years. Well, while I have been here. So
Absolutely.
so it's they're all cheering on what I do. It's very sweet. They're like making dinner and cheering on Sage and
Oh, cool.
everyone. But so. But there's a cost, when I was also involved in the school board, they were like, "We're tired of the school board. Quit the school board stuff because we're so." It's all a season, right? I can do more now than I could when they're in diapers, and it's all a balance, and I definitely don't hit it perfectly, but I try. So.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Thank you for your afternoon. Speaking of taking time out from your family to do work things. So thank you so much, Laura, for all you're doing and for sharing Sage's story and also giving me a little peek into the maybe not completely terrible global American empire.
I didn't mean to digress on that. And I see, wow, it has gotten late. Thank you for your generosity, Benjamin, and going over all these things. And you're listening to me all this time.
Absolutely. Let me
record. Fun to talk. So.